Blacksmith of the Apocalypse. By Arcuser. Chapter 161. The Other Side. You have to get out of there. This is not the dungeon anymore. What? Seth squinted and looked around when he heard Al's warning. He didn't know what it meant, but he trusted the sorceress. Hey, didn't the dungeon Cha? Okay guys, that is enough. I think we should leave for today. Seth interrupted. He clapped his hands and took the lead on the way back. The place really had changed. Rot and mold covered the walls and a kind of sludge and mud took over the floor. Everything was filled with vines and growths. This really didn't seem like the dungeon anymore. There were also no monsters on the way back. Just an unsettling silence interrupted by their steps and the weird drips and crackles in the surroundings. An icy wind was blowing in the hallways, that was not there before. It made their hair rise and their nerves tense. At this point, everyone was clear that something had happened and this was not the dungeon they entered anymore. Stepping out of the entrance they came before a desolate world. It looked like Y City on the surface, but the people and any signs of their existence were gone. In the distance, they could only see the vague silhouettes of the building in the damp fog that filled the world. Guys, I don't think we are in Kansas anymore. I mean Y City. Link quoted an iconic children's movie. You don't say. Suddenly Seth pushed Link out of the way. A weird projectile had shot down from the porch roof of the entrance aiming for the gourmet hunter head. As it shot towards Seth's neck, who had jumped into the trajectory, it was stopped by a bright magical shield the size of a big dish. On the ceiling above them stuck a creature that looked like a chameleon that was partly turned inside out. It had 4 eyes around the head and its mouth split open in a cross shape with 4 jaws. The projectile was a long whip-like tongue with a barbed armored tip. The party got in formation, but the creature fled after its surprise attack failed. Phew, I'm glad it worked. Of course, it worked. I helped after all. What was that shield? Asked Allison while intently staring at him. Tehi, trade secret. The small shield that had blocked the tongue was still hovering around Seth. It was the effect of the new soul helmet he had made and enchanted with the help of Al. He had used several medium souls to boost the loyal soul from medium to big. Since he did not want a helmet that took his vision and lacked the materials to make a good circlet, Seth decided on a soul helmet. Loyal helmet. Rare. Mag DEF 430. 1. Auto shield. A soul helmet that wishes to protect the owner. Can be infused into an item or used as is. Usage requirement, Seth Smith. Toggle skill, auto shield, no cost. The area in a radius of 1 m around the wearer is constantly monitored. Creates a shield with 450 durability in case of an attack. The shield is maintained for 1 minute. Generates up to 7 shields. He made an enchantment with the help of Al that used the property of the soul, the wish to protect. Coupled with the enchantment's shield and detection, the auto shield skill was created. The enchantment needed all the soul's mana to operate, which was why he did not get any bonus mana. But it was a great trade-off considering that he had the means to prevent surprise attacks. Just that it did not help with their current situation. Everyone looked to Seth as he was the leader. They act like a teen in puberty from seeing a kiss in public. You promised not to do anything and naughty. Seth finally spoke indignantly. calling such an innocent kiss naughty. I feel offended, she said with a smirk. There was nothing innocent about that kiss. Everyone here could testify. Anyway, let's get to business, she said and ignored them. The sorceress started chanting accompanied by complicated hand gestures. Complicates runes and sigils started lighting up in the air and on the ground surrounding her. It took almost 15 minutes before the light finally dimmed and her chanting stopped. Very interesting. This is my first time seeing such a phenomenon, she mumbled. So, do you know where we are? Seth interrupted her mumbling. It seems to be a copy of your Earth and then again it isn't. Is it another world? Alzalsa shook her head. No. It's literally like a carbon copy. Like if Earth was a sheet of carbon paper, this is a sheet right below it and many of the details have bled through. I will need to observe some more. It is more like a... There is no easy way to explain, but it's good we left the hospital. Why? All of them asked confused. Because the pathworks are not connected to this place. There are no dungeons. If you had kept acting as if it was a dungeon and died expecting to be revived at the guild, well, you would be dead for good. Wait, you said this had no connection to the pathworks, does this mean this weird space was part of our world, to begin with? This has always been here without us noticing. Allison asked upset. Yep, your world is quite fascinating. But how did we get here? If I had to guess, which I have to, something or someone from this side pulled you over here. That is all well and good, but do you know a way back? Seth interrupted them. Nope. At least there is nothing I can do right now in the time left. I collected all the information and I can probably come up with a way to return. That's great. Link celebrated. Not really. I can summon Al only once a week. This means we have to stay here for at least a week, even if she comes up with a way in the next hour. Isn't that right, Al? Yep, there is nothing I can do about it immediately. So why don't we have some fun until my time runs out? She was drawing closer to Seth when she suddenly said. Don't you dare to cancel the summon. I won't help if you do. Then you will be stuck here for 2 weeks. Seth had no other choice but to take one for the team. She cast a shield to keep the party safe and another, opaque, shield so they had some privacy for their business. Conveniently it also hindered Seth from escaping. A true hero. Link said seriously, but the tears of envy kept flowing down his cheeks. Tekker stayed suspiciously silent, while Allison was red like a tomato and did not even dare to look in the direction of the little love nest. Half an hour later both barriers and Alzalsa disintegrated leaving a disheveled Seth and an embarrassed party behind. I'm just glad Finn isn't here to see this. Seth mumbled as he tried to fix his attire. Chapter 162. Empty world filled with danger. Now that the Lich got what she wanted she became silent and did not react to Seth's attempts of communication. He could only hope she sunk into some state of deep thought to come up with a way to escape. Whatever was the case, the 4 of them and Puffles were now stuck in this familiar not so familiar world. I expected this to be a horror scenario but I expected something like Violent Hill and not Stranger Things. Seth muttered as they walked through the empty twisted streets of this foggy mirror city. They could barely see farther than a few meters in this thick fog that blanketed the streets. What they were looking for was a safe place where they could camp out for the next week until Seth could summon Al again. Technically this meant a place with less tentacles, vines, and goo. Especially less goo and mud. Their feet sank into the viscous substance that covered the streets and at times they feared losing their boots. Seth already had a solution, but his companions hurriedly convinced him to look for a place first and keep that as a last resort. It was quite unsettling to walk through the empty streets that showed no life or sign of human habitation, despite looking like a city. Wait. I heard something. Get ready. Link might lack the attack power of a regular hunter, but he had a particular set of skills of which some were gained from special food. Among them was sharp ears which tremendously enhanced his hearing. The fog might have been able to block his sight, but not his hearing. The gourmet hunter pointed in the direction of an ally and the party got in formation. Seth and Tekker stood in the front and readied their shields. Allison and Link took cover behind them while Puffles protected the rear. It would have been helpful if his teammates also had pets. It was a shame that the pet situation was even worse than the item situation. At the moment only the elite and people with tamer professions had pets that were useful in combat. After a few moments, they could feel the vibrations of heavy thumps from the alley, but they heard no sound. Ting! A tentacle smashed into Tekker's shield and dug into the steel. Another tentacle aimed for Seth but was blocked by the auto shield. What stepped out of the fog was not nice to look at. Allison looked away, Link almost vomited and they could even hear Tekker gag under his helmet. Only Seth was not terribly appalled by the creature. It had a cone-shaped head that split into 4 jaws like the chameleon. Unlike the chameleon, its body was like a giant dog's with terrible acid burns and tumorous growth. Its skin was covered in a yellow pus and several appendages grew from its back. *+ coalive? Observation only gave back a bunch of jumbled gibberish. Seeing its attack fail, the creature gave off a mind-piercing shriek. It was like stabbing an icepick in their brains. Allison lost focus and her skill failed while Link could not act as he reflexively held his head in pain. Only Seth, Tekker, and the Eye-Visor were largely unaffected despite the headache. Seeing his 2 party members affected, Seth decided not to take a chance. Dragon Might. He activated the set skill and the piercing cry of the wyvern sounded from the shield's engraving. The creature's deformed knees instantly buckled as if a great force was pressing down on it. Despite the skill's effect, it kept struggling and its horrifying eyes were fixed on Seth, the source of this overwhelming power. Not for long as Puffles finished his multicast and several light bolts penetrated the monster's flesh and eyes, leaving behind steaming holes. At Seth's signal, Tekker charged at the blinded creature with a shield bash and kept pressing onto it with his heavy shield to sealing its movements completely. The blacksmith stepped before the helpless and blind monster and ended its life by shoving the full length of his burning blade through the head all the way into the torso. There was no experience but ding! The wyvern blade has tasted extraordinary blood. It gained +1 additional damage. You have gained +1 willpower. What happened next made Tekker shrink back in disgust. The creature's body started to dissolve into black sludge and fog. All that was left, to Seth's surprise, was a soul. It was slightly bigger and had a violet hue. Soul, medium, crafting material. Uncommon. An uncommon soul. How long had it been since he last found one? Ho ho, these creatures are quite special. A previously silent lich suddenly called out. So you were awake? Go ahead, what is special about them? You could say this soul has an inherent attribute of the mind. That cry was a mental attack and it was able to resist the dragon might. Their natural willpower must be quite high then, since I gained a full point with that one attack. You gained an attribute point. One of the things Seth had forgotten to mention was that he had weapons that could strengthen the user's status. But this was a good turn of events. Willpower was not only the basis of mental strength but also for mental resistance. Well, it made sense, that the higher one's mental strength, the higher their resistance against mental attacks. He lent the other 3 a demonic weapon each. If they found another one of the monsters, Seth would immediately use Dragon Might and all of them would start hacking at it. Like this, they could increase their will until none of them was affected by the mental attacks. Fear quickly subsided in the face of absolute gains. And the creatures of this land, who had known no fear until now, were introduced to a cruel reality. The party started to actively search for these sweet pots of permanent improvements. In their eyes, these sickening creatures now looked like the loveliest piggies for slaughter they had ever seen. Even Allison became a wild berserker when slashing at the creature to draw as much blood as possible. Their hunt had several obvious benefits. The first was the strengthening of the party. The second was that most of them dropped uncommon souls. Which would have been even more awesome if he had not been interrupted by a notification after he collected the second soul. Ding! The host of many is watching you with great interest. This dampened his mood a little, but he let it go since Samuel had said that there was nothing bad about being watched by gods. The third benefit was that he could study the practical effects of these blood drinker weapons. While Seth gained 0.5 to 1 point of will at the start, he soon only gained something every second time and then every third time. Past 80 he hardly gained any more. Talker was in a similar situation. He also started with around 70 points of willpower and earned less and less the closer he got to 80. The weapon stats did not increase as much. Allison and Link on the other hand kept getting consistent gains, even after almost 20 monsters. This brought Seth to the conclusion that the creatures in this area all had about 80 in willpower and they could no gain anything past that using the enchantment. For the Blood Drinker enchantment to work, the most effective one needed to fight something that was stronger than oneself in a specific area. Unfortunately, they ran out of monsters before the other 2 could reach that threshold. After 23 monsters they could not find any more, no matter how hard they looked. Since their prey was hiding, they decided to take a break. The original goal was to find a safe place. Unwittingly they had created a safe space on their own. Maybe this week would not be as nerve-wracking as they had expected. Chapter 163. Not all who wander are lost. The sky started to darken and the bloodthirsty crew decided to carefully enter one of the buildings. As the city outside, everything was empty. Empty hallways, empty rooms, empty doorways, everything lacked signs of human presence. The dark vines and growths that covered the walls were the only thing except for the cold stone walls. It just looked man-made, but might have been a natural structure. It was important to stay vigilant in such a tight space. If something like the chameleon thing attacked them, it might be hard to dodge an injury or even a casualty. Night had fallen outside and everything had gone dark. Seth and the gourmet hunter didn't need light, but Allison cast a magic light for herself, Tecker and Puffles. This was the reason Seth had almost missed a dim light in one of the rooms down a corridor when they came upon a crossroad. He signaled the party to follow him and they slowly went to the room with the dim light. The others could not see this light, but Seth knew exactly what it was. The rest of the party was surprised to find the desiccated and overgrown skeletal remains of a human. His clothes were dirty and ripped apart, but they were recognizable as modern streetwear. At one point this man had worn black jeans and a white button-up shirt. This looks really old. He might have died even before the apocalypse. Allison suggested. Judging by the state of the remains, this corpse is at least 1 year old. Asserted Al, speaking to everyone this time. Who said that? Was that Al's Alsa? Al could talk to everyone? So, she just had fun making him look stupid, talking to himself. Seth just nodded at the party's questions, he was occupied. Above the ribcage of the remain floated a dim blue soul. Wanderer's soul, small, crafting material, uncommon, degraded. The lost soul of an unwitting wanderer. Spirited away from his world. It was his first time seeing a degraded soul. Seth had assumed that there might exist something like this, but... well, it wasn't like he went around looking for souls a lot in the past. He was grinding for one, and the other reason was, that it did not make sense in a world with dungeons. Dungeons generate anywhere they got a chance to. An old ruin? Dungeon. A big tomb? Dungeon. A giant cave? Dungeon. The problem was that dungeons dissolved any and all corpses in them for sustenance. It made little sense for Seth to go around and look for the souls of fallen heroes or stuff like that. The souls did not automatically come to him, the reason was... ding! A quest has been triggered. Quest, Wanderer's Request. Difficulty, C. You have encountered the lost souls of a wanderer. On the way back home from work, he was spirited away from his world. Desperately he fought to return. He was a normal person without power but managed to survive in this inhospitable dimension for several months trying to return home. Lastly, he lost not only his way but also his life before he could return home to his sister. Will you help the soul? Requirement, find the sister and make sure of her well-being 0/1. Rewards, restoration of the lost soul, small, lost soul, small. Do you accept the quest? A short sob story clip had shown him a short glimpse of the man's struggles. Had this happened after the apocalypse, this man could have been among the top few percent. The world was not fair, and it became even scarier after finding this dimension. He accepted the quest since it was not that hard with his connections. Like before the soul vanished. The party was still caught in their own thoughts and what it meant to have found this corpse in this weird place. Seth had already gotten a bit numb to their own world's weirdness after his talk with Simon. Or maybe it was just calm reaction. Anyway, he crouched down and started looting the corpse and looking for usable stuff. Ripping away the small roots and plants that had grown on the bones, he found a wallet and a moldy little notebook. Seth knew his and the sister's name and looks from the vision, but with the wallet, he had all his personal information. The notebook was a diary that started sometime after he arrived in this world. The vision he had seen was more or less a summary of this book. This person had actually managed to survive in this world. He hunted these creatures with traps to cripple them and then overcame his disgust to cut off and eat their flesh while they were still alive. This guy had survived like that and wandered around the city for months to find a way back. Seth flipped through the pages and skimmed through the text and suddenly stopped at a specific entry. It was one of the last entries. Today I saw people in the city. I almost couldn't believe what I saw. They were 3 people of unearthly beauty and they rode on giant white horses through the streets. All of them had a halo and seemed to emit light in this disgusting thick fog. 2 of them wore luxuriant medieval armor and weapons. The third wore a gorgeous dress and surpassed the other 2 in beauty. Her fair skin was like porcelain and her flaxen hair like golden threads. I was spellbound and could move as they passed me. They spoke with each other in melodious language and their velvety voices healed my soul. Just thinking back at the encounter warms my heart. I followed them and found that they camp on one of the squares. Maybe they know a way back. I will observe for a bit longer and maybe approach them. Seth had a bad feeling about this. The next few entries were about him observing them and describing them with a flowery vocabulary. The second to last entry mentioned that he planned to approach them. Looking at the corpse before him, this encounter probably did not go well. I feel so weak. I feel so hungry. My skin is. My blood is. I should not have approached them. I don't think I will survive this. I'm sorry, Eva. Brother won't come home. This was the last entry, written with chaotic handwriting on a page somewhere in between the empty ones in the back of the notebook. He had a lump in his throat. When he let the others read, Link had a similar reaction. Tekker had wet eyes and Allison outright cried a little. They decided to camp in this room tonight. None of them felt awkward because of the skeleton, they all felt like lending this brave man some company. Even so, he was already dead. We should look for his sister and tell her about his fate, Tekker said resolutely. Link looked confused but Allison nodded approvingly. Without the quest, Seth might not have agreed with them, but like this, he was happy about the chance of getting some free help. Sure, I plan to ask the church to look into it. Maybe I could even ask the SDD about all this. They made a fire and talked a little more while eating some of their rations. They decided to sleep in shifts and Allison went ahead and closed the doorway with a stone wall, an earth spell. The night was uneventful. Except for some unsettling loud thumps in the distance, that is. They were more or less well rested in the morning. The thumps in the distance had become louder. Seth. You should come and see this. Chapter 164. The taller they are, the harder they fall. Allison called. She stood at the window and looked outside with a shocked expression. Seth stepped beside her at the window just in time to see a giant leg descend from the thick fog above them. The leg was comparable to a bus in size and covered in a rough carapace. The faded cement grey color resembled the surrounding building-like structures. It smashed the street's surface and created a deep crater. Seth stared at the giant crustacean leg. Allison, this is too big for our cooking pot. Stop being greedy. I didn't mean that, she said blushing. I know. We should. He was interrupted by the sound of falling rubble and breaking buildings. They could hear a muffled war cry swelling in the distance. The next moment the thick pillar of a leg lifted off the ground and started toppling into the structures on the opposite side of the street. Following from the fog was another leg and somewhere in the fog above them, they could make out the silhouette of a giant knee or joint that stopped lowering somewhere above the buildings. Did whoever owned those legs just falter? Maybe we should get some distance. Everyone nodded and hurriedly left the building running in the opposite direction of the giant legs. They heard another cry and the knees that had floated in the sky crashed to the ground. Standing to the side they watched the landscape get crushed under the falling colossus. Like a previously floating island, the body came barreling down flattening several apartment complexes. I really want to go home. Tekker mumbled. Everyone nodded in agreement. The creature's knees had buckled and its shape became vaguely visible. What became visible in the fog was the shape of something like a giant spider or harvestman. They all were twitching in disgust, it really looked like it would harvest one's soul with just its looks. Allison and Link already had a problem with the small representatives of their kind, imagine seeing a creature like this, but the size of a small mountain. This time they could hear the war cry clearly as a mass of light exploded somewhere above the creature's body and made it finally crash onto the structures on the ground. Big regret grasped the group's heart. They would have preferred if this thing had stayed up in the fog. Various tentacles, mandibles, and feelers were still moving vigorously until there were a few more harsh explosions and they started moving slower before going limp. Someone or something had killed this giant. Let's leave. I suddenly feel like going back to the hospital. Seth suggested and everyone agreed to evacuate the area. Nobody argued in favor of trying to talk with whoever just killed that thing. Seth thought about whether he would have been able to kill this thing, it was definite maybe. With all the power he had gotten for his fire, he might have been able to turn it into charcoal. On the other hand, he would have rather chosen to cripple it and run away. He could really go without the terrible headache that came with overexerting an ability. Where are you going? Didn't we just agree to get as far away, from this place, as possible so we would not meet? Tekker had started answering when he realized his mistake. Everyone else had frozen in shock. It was not any one of them that had asked the question. Except for the big tank, everyone was staring at a tall figure standing behind them. She had a swan-like neck, long slender limbs, and big almond-shaped eyes. She looked off, but very ethereal and beautiful, only at the cusp of the uncanny valley. If Seth had not already met elves before, he might have mistaken her for one. What calmed down him slightly was that she did not quite fit the people from the diary. She had no halo and her clothes were covered in dirt and a darkish blue ooze. Considering that she took the initiative to talk to them instead of immediately attacking made Seth believe there was a chance of survival. He had no doubt this person was the one that just ended Daddy Longlegs' life and had almost blinked right behind them. As such, he put on his best business smile. "Greetings. Is there something you need from us?" Confused at the sudden change in attitude, the new guest made a step back. "What are you doing in this place?" "Humans are prohibited here," she said with a serious tone after she adapted to the situation. "Be assured, we do not wish to be here either. Wherever here is, we were pulled here against our will. Could you maybe tell us how we get back to Earth?" "No idea. But this is my first time meeting a human. Are you guys strong? I, the Amazon Leica, challenge you to a duel." Seth had black lines on his forehead. They had met a muscle brain. How to disarm a muscle brain? "Oh, I'm sorry, but none of us are fighters that could rival you in strength. We have a tank that can take a beating, but not put up a fight. Those two are pure ranged fighters and I'm a blacksmith. Really none of us would be a match for an Amazon like yourself. I hope a great warrior like yourself won't take joy in beating up the weak." She fixated on the four of them for a while and ended up sighing. "I guess you are right. Looking at you people, there is no enjoyable fight to be had with you." The four heaved a sigh of relief. "No beating today. Well, then, take care of yourself." With that, she turned around and attempted to leave. "Ah, 1 second, please. Didn't you say humans were prohibited here? And where are we?" Seth asked her before she could leave. It would be very helpful to hear from a person that might actually know. She scratched her head for a moment as if thinking about stuff. "I'm not an enforcer, so why would I care about the rule? As for what here is, nah, too hard to explain. Just make sure to find a way home soon. This place can be ugly for humans." With that, she vanished. It was not magic or anything, but more like a martial arts movie, when someone is too fast to see their movement. Seth had experienced meeting magical races during his trip to Aura. He was a lot calmer than the rest, despite this being his first Amazonas. "Is it just me feeling aroused?" the gourmet hunter suddenly asked. "What are? Come on. Didn't you see her? And she's not just sexy but also really strong. Who doesn't have a thing for tall strong women? Do you think I would have a chance if..." The look in Allison's eyes made him shut up. Had she been a witch, Link would have already turned into a cockroach by now. Maybe Seth could buy her a skill scroll with that skill? Before they left, Seth checked on the Daddy Longlegs, but it had already turned into fog and sludge. The party found a new building to make their base for the next 6 days. Hopefully, Al would be able to come up with a way to return. As the only person that had traveled to a different world before, he was the expert of xenobiology in their group. Excluding the 200 years old sorceress. "Did you ever meet an Amazonas before? Are they all this strong?" Allison asked him as they sat around the fire. "No, not really. I met quite a few weird races, but not Amazons. Until today I too, thought they were just myths." "Do you think all myths are actually true?" she continued a little shaky. She thought of all the terrifying mythology out there that might prove to be true. Seth thought of the fact that gods, demons, and angels had already started moving. What guarantee was there that not all of the ancient folklore would come down on them? Looking at the world, it might be the case. They spend the next 3 days there while occasionally hunting the weird monsters of this place. Although they varied in size and design, their skill sets were all similarly focused on mind attacks. As such, they were no big hurdle, once they were suppressed by dragon might. When they encounter creatures like the chameleon, Seth would rigorously set the whole building on fire and they would wait outside. This was not just a great way to have a bonfire and get rid of enemies in these narrow environments, it also helped Seth increase his fire affection to leave 6. The most valuable that came from these hunts were the uncommon souls the creature dropped once in a while. It was the 4th day of their stay when they heard the sound of chimes for the streets outside. A small group of people, with flags and chimes like a procession, was traveling along the road. They looked very clean and unearthly with their head being illuminated by a faint halo. Chapter 165. Nowhere to hide. The moment he saw this group, it was clear to Seth that these were the people mentioned in the diary. He used concealment and signaled the other to do the same. Allison cast a hiding spell on herself and Tecker, while Link used a similar skill from the hunter skill set. They did not dare to look out the window and only listened to the sound of the chimes with bated breath. Beside the chimes, they could also hear the clear voices of these passers-by. Like a clear harmony, their idle talk was unaffected by the fog. There are surprisingly little nightmares in this region. Someone must have trespassed and hunted them. We should be careful. I heard even a Gaisk vanished here. As if. It's just a rumor. There is no need to worry if it's just some human like last time. He was weak but surprisingly witty. Good thing he actually approached us first. We might not have been able to get him otherwise. Oh please. You wouldn't have gotten him. Not all of us lack in detection magic like you. With that, they stopped talking and only the chimes could be heard. They became quieter and quieter until they slowly faded in the distance. A huge weight lifted off the party's chest. Maybe we should relocate? Tecker asked after a while. No, I think it's better to stay put. We have not seen those guys in the last 3 days. If they are a regular patrol, we are gone by the next time they come along. We could come across another patrol if we move now. I agree with Allison. It's darkest under the lantern. They just came by here and didn't get suspicious, so this is the safest place for now. Seth said, and even Link nodded. Tecker also agreed to stay after Allison's explanation. They would stay here like before but refrain from further hunts. Although Seth could get uncommon souls from these creatures, there was really no need to risk meeting that glowfolk. He already had almost 20 small and 10 medium-sized uncommon souls. It was enough to experiment with once they got back home. They stayed put in the building for the time being and used the day to rest. Alzalsa had already told them that she had found a way to transport them back to Earth. As long as she was summoned, she could warp them back. Apparently, the problem had been easier than she had thought. This was not some twin dimension of sorts, but a hub world. It was the fog that acted as a medium for the travel between places that mirrored each other here and in other dimensions. She had given them a simple explanation and it sounded very mystical. Seth remembered some old legends that had similar stuff. Just another 2 days of laying low and... Guys, I need your help. She's severely injured and needs first aid. On the morning of the 6th day, the gourmet hunter suddenly kicked open their door after he went to scout the vicinity. In his arms, he held the barely conscious and heavily bleeding Amazon. Oh no, you didn't. Please, we have to help her, he said again and put her on the ground. This guy really had a heavy crush on this slender mythological creature. He endangered their whole party because he had a fantasy boner. The corner of Seth's eye twitched as he tried not to smite the fool. Allison lacked his iron will and kicked the hunter in the head. Feeling satisfied with that, Seth heaved a sigh. It was already too late to put the Amazon back on the street now, so he summoned Puffles to heal her. Thank you, Laika mumbled after her face started to look like a face again and less like something you would get at the meat counter in a supermarket. Don't thank me. I would have preferred if that idiot left you wherever he picked you up. Seth said honestly. At this point it didn't that she could probably wipe them out. Someone out there beat her to near death and Seth had no wish to meet those people. Especially since he had a suspicion about who they were. She didn't get angry and only nodded understandingly. As a warrior, she understood his mindset, especially since they were not very strong. Once her bones were set and the worst wounds were dealt with, Puffles took a break. He was very exhausted. The strength difference was just too huge, so it took a lot of effort to heal her. So, who beat you up? Seth asked unceremoniously. They needed to be sure, so they could make the right decision. They call themselves the Dwathade. They are sneaky and dishonest. I asked for a fair duel and the moment we started fighting, the people in the audience cast a weird curse on me that suppressed all my power. They all attacked and I could only run away. My power is still not recovered. She explained, depressed. She had been fleeing from them for the whole night. She collapsed once she finally managed to lose them. The gourmet hunter had found her soon after. But you could have beaten them, if not for the weird magic. Easily. The party held a meeting about what to do. It had not been long since Laika managed to lose the glowfolk. They would definitely search the area. It was best to leave immediately. But the actual question was whether they could completely lose those pursuers. Leave it to me. I have a great idea how to cover all our traces, he said with a meaningful smile. After the Amazon drank an HP potion and rested a little, she was able to walk again. The party was ready to leave and watched Seth's actions with great interest. He had really wanted to do this for a long time. It had been like an itch. Seth had really held back every time they smoked out a building. He summoned the furnace, fired it up until the pale flames flared like a jet flame, and then kicked it over. All the tiny roots, vines, and disgustingly fleshy veins that covered everything in this place caught fire like tinder. Okay. Let's hurry before we get surrounded by the fire. It was a race against the fire that was spreading all across the structures around them. With Laika's directions, they managed to leave the pseudo-city. Only after leaving the danger zone, did they dare to turn around and look. The rising heat dispelled the thick fog that blanketed the world and revealed a terrifying sight. Once again, the pale fire covered a whole cityscape in an eerie inferno. Ding! The Lord of the Redlands is clapping joyfully watching your decisive actions. The gods were still peeping on him even here. Ding! Title, Arsonist Leave 2 has become Master Arsonist. You have burned your second city. You can no longer deny your nature. Pyrokinesis +1. Now, his mood was gone, but the title's effect was really good. At least he was not the only one who was spellbound by the scenery, the whole party was staring into the fire. Lastly, Seth summoned and desummoned the furnace. Now there were no traces of them left. Except for the raging fire, but nobody could prove that they started it. Seth clapped his hand to bring them back to the present. Let's leave. We wouldn't want to meet some medium rare and angry glow people, right? Everyone hesitatingly nodded and turned away from the burning city. They walked across a dead wasteland covered in fog. Seth's only worry was that they needed to return if they wanted to get back home. Chapter 166. Chase. Where did this fire come from? He pressed out between clenched teeth. Stop talking and concentrate on stabilizing the shield, the other reprimanded him. The patrol had split up in search of the Amazon that had intruded. The two had been looking for traces and found a burned-out building they were investigating when the sudden wave of fire swallowed the pillars of stone. The incredible heat singed their hair even with the shield they were painstakingly maintaining together. These two were still lucky to have entered an already burned-out building, so they only had to withstand a fracture of the fire's heat. Who knew what happened to the rest of their team? The fire washed past them in a matter of minutes, after which they broke down in exhaustion. After the shield was gone, hot air rushed at them. It was almost too hot to breathe. Looking out the window, it was the first time they saw this place without thick fog. Instead, the cityscape was twisted with heat flares and filled with the crackling of heated stone. Had the fire lasted longer, maybe all these structures would have broken apart. What was that? He said, gasping. I don't know, but someone must have set this off. Maybe the Amazon. Or whoever burned off the world roots in this building beforehand. Another intruder. Probably. We should go look for the others if there are still others. The party stayed close to the road that led away from the city. There was not much more they could do if they did not want to lose their way in the fog. Seth approached Tecker, who was walking in the front. Tecker, take this. Just in case we have to confront them at some point. Seth brought out an armor box. Tecker's eyes shone with a bright light when his eyes well on the contents. Are you sure you want to give me this? I will lend it to you. It would suck if your tank dies because of crappy armor. Also, it's the only full suit I have that can change its size. You are really strong. Are you really just a blacksmith? Laika asked, approaching them from behind. The phrase "just a blacksmith" irked Seth somehow. Seth thought of Tord's power. What makes you think I am not just a blacksmith? The dwarf had easily handled Seth even when he started using the fire aura in the sparring sessions. Blacksmiths can be really terrifying, you know. Laika's eyes widened. Really? Oh yeah. I once heard of a very terrifying blacksmith. His deeds were a nightmare story for young nobles. The Amazon's eyes widened like a deer in the headlamps when Al in her astral form joined the conversation. Oh, do tell. Seth was also interested. They had long left the city and slowed down considerably. The rest of the party also sharpened their ears to listen to their idle talk. Okay then. The smith was called Wayland. In his youth, his village was raided and he had to flee into the mountains. After the death of all his relatives and the village burned down, he could only try to survive in the mountains. When he was almost starved to death, he was found by a dwarven woman, who was kind enough to adopt him. He was allowed to live among the dwarfs, where he learned his craft from a divine dwarven grandmaster Blacksmith. He had a great talent and soon had learned everything the master was willing to teach. Now he was an adult and knew a craft. It was time for him to leave and join his own people. He made a name for himself as a great blacksmith and soon got the attention of a king. He was invited to his castle and commissioned with the production of a legendary sword. In the night the king's men assaulted him in his sleep and cut the tendons in his knee pits. Like this, he would never be able to run or jump again. It was the idea of the queen, to make sure that they would never lose such a good blacksmith. Locked into the smithy, Wayland was left with no choice but to make the sword for the king, but secretly he planned his revenge. With the kingdom's resources, he made a sword of incomparable power. Using a simple trick, he then switched it with a weaker blade he delivered to the king. The vain king could not discern the difference and was very happy, granting more freedom to the blacksmith. He used the new freedom to seduce the king's daughter behind his back. When the king asked for 2 new luxuriant cups, he slew the king's 2 young sons and fashioned a pair of sublime golden chalices from their skulls, which he delivered to the oblivious king and queen. After drinking from the skulls of their own family, the couple was cursed by the gods and soon died a painful death from illness. Now only the princess and Wayland's unborn son were left to inherit the kingdom. The moral of the story is to never underestimate a blacksmith, even if he is weak or crippled even. The party was not too shocked by the story. They were used to modern horror, so the story was still somewhat mild. But the Amazon became pale like a ghost when the lich talked about the parents drinking from their children's skulls. She slowly nodded when Al summarized the moral. Yes, I understand. Just like God Hephaestus, even if he is lame and ugly, it never bodes well to underestimate him. So it was because he is a blacksmith. Seth nodded approvingly, while the rest of the party could not quite understand this jump in logic there. Thank you for enlightening me. My seniors always said blacksmiths were weak and not worth an Amazon's attention, but they were simply ignorant. By the way, are you talking about the Olympian god Hephaestus? Theta, a district covering a warm subcontinent, was the origin of this mythology on Earth. Although that region was now overrun by monsters, Thentian mythology was actually quite popular in Earth. Although, no one knew where exactly Mount Olympus was supposed to be on Earth. Since she knew Hephaestus, were they really like those mythological Amazons? They kept talking for a little while and Seth got the impression that they were a race of muscle brains. They looked down on the use of weapons and armors and instead trained their bodies to an unfathomable level. They sounded like they were body cultivators, but in their case, it was a racial trait. They had no mystical technique that could be explained and learned. The party joined their talk and soon they also started about their home and the system. The path works? They are actually quite a fun way to discover new places, she stated happily. She was not part of the system, so she, unfortunately, had no helpful tips or tricks to cheese the system. From her point of view, the pathworks were portals that would bring you to a random world. Without the guidance of the system god, a targeted journey was impossible. The party told the interested Amazon about all the changes that had happened to their world and the system, that suddenly gave the magical powers, and Leica listened with a bright sparkle in her eyes. Maybe I should visit your world at some point in the future. It sounds really interesting. You could come with us, once Al brings us back. Allison suggested enthusiastically, grabbing the Amazon's arm. No, once you guys are safe, I will return to my own world and recover. I might seem quite free, but I actually have duties to fulfill, you know. She had gotten them into this mess and she was responsible enough to stay and help in case something happened. They kept moving for the whole day and finally camped out beside the street. Tomorrow the token's cooldown would end and they could return home. Chapter 167. Foggy Night. A ghoulish chime gave the gourmet hunter who stood guard goosebumps. It also woke the rest of the party resting around the burned-down campfire. A group of will-o'-the-wisp lit up in the fog surrounding them. Ignis Fatui. The Amazon mumbled with shock on her face. The ghoulish chime rang from the ball of light floating in the fog. Their pursuers had caught up with them. Everyone got ready to fight. Allison cast a buff on everyone while Seth and Tekker wore their armors. Tekker wore an intimidating black suit of armor, the dark knight set Seth had given him the other day. One had to admit that it looked even fiercer on the hulking giant that was Tekker. Seth really wanted to give him a giant sword or halberd now, and then kick him off a ledge. Cancel the last bit. There is no escape for you, trespassers. Bright flashes of magic shot at them from 3 different directions. Evade it. That's the magic that weakened me. Laika warned in a panic. Puffles summoned a shield to block all 3 attacks, but when they hit the barrier Seth got a notification. Ding! Your pet Puffles has been cursed. All stats will be lowered by 80% for 72H. Seriously? Puffles, get back in the pet space. Take care everyone, the curse also hits you if you block it. The moment Puffles' shield was gone, another 3 flashes shot at them from 3 other directions. Everyone hurried to evade after Seth's warning. Were there 6 enemies? Or did they change positions to confuse them? The fog was simply too thick to see. Allison, can you do something about this? Seth asked the All-Elements wizard. I'm on it, she barked and concentrated on chanting. Tekker, Link, you guys protect her, I will try something else. So what if he could not see the enemy? As long as he got the general direction, his bow could do the rest. With that thought, he brought out the upgraded cursed bow and started shooting arrows in the directions where the curses came from. Unfortunately, there was no sound in the fog, except for the unnerving chimes. Seth had no clues as to whether he hit someone or not. He had more than 200 basic arrows, he just kept shooting. As long as he hit, the curse might do the rest. It also distracted the glow people from casting their curses even if he did not hit them. After another wave of curses where Tekker was almost hit, Allison cast a wind blast that forcefully pushed back the fog wall, revealing 4 figures stumbling from the sudden push. 4? With a quick scan, Seth saw 2 figures winding in pain on the ground. He had hit someone. And there really were 6. At least they didn't look as glowy anymore. Their glorious long manes of hair had burned away in the heat of the burning city, they were all bald. Together with some of them still having terrible burn marks and ripped clothes. They looked like some outlaw raiders. The 4 left looked at their fallen comrades that were suffering from necrotizing arrow wounds. They knew that their comrades had been hit but could not ascertain their situation in the fog. Now you've done it. You will die here, one of them shouted angrily and stormed at them, pulling a slender sword made from some kind of clear crystal straight out of the air. As if he formed it from the fog. The others did the same and rushed them. Although Tekker had no taunting skills, the Dark Knight armor worked just fine. These people were too strong to get the debuff, but they were provoked by the armor's effect. 2 were rushing at Tekker while Seth and the Gourmet Hunter took on 1 each. Link had no skills to end his attacker, but he was able to keep him occupied by using traps. Seth blocked the crystal sword with the wyvern shield and the tremendous force that hit the shield. The shield was still impeccable, but Seth lost some health from the force. Dragon Might. Ugh, the eyes of the dragon face on the shield lit up and all the glow people suddenly stopped and crouched down a little, as if lifting a heavy weight on their shoulders. The Amazon was not much better off, as she was not part of their party. What is DHI? Seth did not miss his chance and hacked away at the confused attacker in front of him. The sharp blade of the Kriegsmesser made from wyvern tooth easily split the head in 2, from crown to neck. The other Twatheta looked shocked in their direction, seeing one of them actually dying. These people were strong. They had high physical strength and were probably even better with magic. But they wore no armor and could ultimately not withstand the power of Seth's weapon with just their physical bodies. Their mistake was that they had simply underestimated them for being humans. They had not expected a bunch of players. Link and Tekker had also managed to injure their opponents using the moment of surprise, but they did not manage to take a life. But now that the blacksmith was free to join them, it was different. Seth had no scruples about dashing into the fight when he saw a chance and striking down the enemy from behind. Others might have called this cowardly, but who would dare to say it to his face after watching him unhesitatingly split a person in 2 from behind? Allison blew another one away with a blaze wave after he got stuck in one of the hunter's traps. Just as Seth attempted to strike down the last one standing, an unexpected curse came flying in his direction. Laika finally showed her worth and pulled Seth out of the line of fire at the last moment. It was the attack of one of the arrow victims who had just lay on the ground until now. The other one was frantically chanting something as a purple magic formation grew below him. Quick, stop him! He's opening some kind of passage. Before anyone else got to the man lying on the ground, he was silenced by the Gourmet Hunter's arrow that thrust in his throat. You have to get away from here. Although he did not manage to open the passage, the other side should have received the coordinates. Seth sighed. There were really no breaks. But there was something he had to do first. Check his spoils. Soul, big, crafting material. uncommon. The 6 Twatheta had dropped 3 big souls. What a great haul! Seth looked for their weapons or armor, but they had nothing on them, so he incinerated the corpses before the party fled. This time they followed the road back to the, now burned out, city. There were only a few hours left on the cooldown. Once they summoned Al, there was no need to worry anymore. Even if their pursuers found them before they returned. The sorceress asserted that she could easily wipe the floor with these people. They ran for their dear life all the way back to the city and hid in one of the empty charred buildings. They went all the way to the top floor where they finally broke down in exhaustion. Seth gave everyone a small stamina potion to help recover. If their pursuers found them, it would be best to be in top form. And so, they waited. Being on the rooftop, it was as if they stood on a tiny island in a silent ocean of fog. They were strung to the breaking point as they listened into the fog for the most minutes, noises and changes in the idly blowing wind. The wait was the worst. And for hours, they waited. With bloodshot eyes, they finally heard a distant chime. They heard the chime for another hour as it became louder and quieter. Until it sounded clear and close, as if those people had stopped right before the building below them. Cool down is up. Let's go, let's go. Seth suddenly broke the solemn atmosphere and summoned the spicy sorceress. Alzalsa made a few erratic gestures with her hands and chanted. A purple magic formation, similar to the one the enemy had cast, appeared below her feet, and the fog in front of her started coagulating into a dull grey mirror. This is the portal. Just go through it, she told them. I guess this is goodbye then. Laika said with a smile. The Amazon had made it clear that she would go to her own home, once she knew they were safe. Now, she summoned a similar portal using an item and vanished in her own dull mirror. After the Amazon had left, the party also hurried into the portal the sorceress had created. When only Seth was left, she stopped him. Are you sure I shouldn't just wipe those guys out? Can you leave them a present? They both smiled and left after the sorceress left the present. Chapter 168. What are you doing here? What are you doing here? 3 people said in sync. They were seated around a small round coffee table in a tiny but cozy study. One of them looked haggard and pale, with a beard and hair so dense and black it made him look even paler. But nothing could hide his handsomeness and the fascinating attraction that radiated from his deep dark eyes. Once again we are aiming for the same man, nephew, he spoke to one of the 2 others. This man's build was also slim, but his bare arms bulged with hardened muscle. His face too was covered in a beard. It was a dark reddish brown, like the light of embers shining on soot. His face was normal, but the big crooked nose and wild beard gave him a rough and unattractive look. The man sighed. Uncle, how come we always choose the same one? Can't you look for people among other professions? They were interrupted by the 3rd man. It's great that you 2 have a family reunion, but can you have that somewhere else and leave him to me? He had a long handsome face with a dark goatee and a big toothy grin. He wore a thin sleeveless white linen coat and beige wide trousers. His clothes revealed his broad muscular body that was honed by battle and covered in scars. His wild mane of black long hair was tamed in 2 triangular top knots that stood up at the back of his head. His eyes, focusing the other 2, were 2 intimidating empty holes that spoke of war and destruction. Oh, please. Stop the parlor tricks. You won't impress anyone with that, said the haggard one with a voice so cold it made the other shudder. I see you are having fun. Let me join, said a joyful voice. A 4th person had entered the room and just closed the door behind himself. This person was very different from the others. The newcomer wore a blue robe with all kinds of chaotically scribbled yellow stars on it. He also wore a matching cone-shaped hat. On the robe fell a long snow-white beard that almost touched the ground. It was tucked behind a broad leather belt. When he turned his face towards them, there was nothing. It was like the featureless face of a mannequin made of polished black marble. This was the system god and host of this little get-together. The 3 guests froze from the sudden appearance of the host. You don't seem to be up for fun anymore, he said, a little disappointed. From somewhere in his endless wizard robe he pulled out a common clipboard and pencil. Then should we start with business? After all, I am a very busy person, you know. I recently found a really funny guy to watch on the northeast of Earth. Anyways. You guys were invited here because all of you claim patronage of, wait a minute, he moved the pencil as if searching for something on the clipboard. The blacksmith Tim Thornhammer, yes, he looked up questioning. Not? Oh, my fault, my fault. Wrong blacksmith with a ridiculous name. Here he is, Seth Smith. And you want the system to rule in this case. The system god sat down on the table and a tiny espresso cup appeared before everyone. Then tell me your claims and we will see who claims the exclusive streaming rights, I mean patronage. Let's start to my left and go clockwise, yes. The man with the ember beard stood up to speak, as he sat directly left to the system god. He is a blacksmith through and through. As the god of blacksmiths, I, Hephaestus, want to take him as my champion on earth. I think this is more than enough justification. The system god nodded at him as a sign that he heard him and that he could sit back down. Next, he looked at the haggard man. He did not stand up to speak, like his nephew. He inherited the class of one of my previous champions. His abilities dabble in my jurisdiction. I don't think it is appropriate for him to have the powers, without being my chosen champion. As such I demand exclusive streaming rights, I mean patronage of this man. He had kept a cool atmosphere that was broken when he accidentally spoke his thoughts. Kakeek. You pretentious people. Lastly the burly man spoke, he also did not bother to stand up to speak. Nobody has more justification than me. He carries my name. Since ancient times this is an act of asking for my powers. His fighting style fits me, too. He's ruthless and takes any chance without being hindered by useless chivalry. And the way he uses fire, merciless like the desert sun. And I also have some power over ores, so he is totally mine. Stop arguing with me already. The system god nodded with crossed arms after hearing all of their claims. Except for Seth, all your claims are valid. Hey! You are being biased. He carries my name, doesn't he? By ancient's right, he is one of mine. It's a rule. Suddenly the room became dark and the system god's presence swelled by several tens of times. I am the system god, I am the rules. Then he returned back to normal. Got it? Your objections have been heard. I have made a decision. Even so the face was featureless, they could hear the god's smirk. You three will share the streaming rights and neither of you will become his full patron. Each of you will give him a blessing outside of your realm of expertise. It can't be part of your main aspect. On the other hand, you are allowed to keep your right of choosing an additional personal champion. A champion can be shared. Hephaestus asked doubtfully. Did I stutter? I am the rules. He can be shared if I say so. It will also be fun to see you three share the streaming rights. And just like this, it was decided, that Seth would not become the champion of one god, but gain blessings from three different ones. The system god stayed seated as the other three grumbling gods stood up and left the room. They needed to come up with a way to share the rights and what kind of blessing they were to give Seth. Why had the system god made this kind of decision? He brought up the clipboard, which had turned into a tablet PC and showed the scene of Seth and his party returning to Y City. This god had also watched Seth once in a while. He even helped him once. The simple reason for his decision was, that it was much more interesting this way. He had no idea what blessing these three would give Seth, but it would definitely become funny since they had to bless him with something not part of their direct authority. Otherwise, the god would have had an easy time foreseeing Seth's future path. As the champion of Hephaestus, he would have started making mind-blowing weapons and probably created an army of automatons. This was still a possibility, so this blessing might have been redundant and just saved him some time. As the champion of Hades, he would probably have concentrated on the aspects of the afterworld. Maybe he would have chosen to become a necromancer and revive demigods as soldiers or stuff like that. With Seth's blessing, he would have probably turned into a crazy but very charismatic warlord. But now, the possibilities were endless. The system god watched in excitement. Chapter 169. Taking a break. The party stumbled out of the gate and stood on a dark street in the middle of the city. The street was empty and the night was quiet. Not ghostly quiet, but the quiet of a big city. It was soothing. Even if it was empty and dark, they could feel the city breathing, the presence of people, and the small sound and background noise that assured them that they were not alone in the world. Link knelt on the ground and kissed the boardwalk's concrete with tears in his eyes. Despite playing tough most of the time, this trip had hit him harder than it seemed. Seth, here, take it back. It was Tekker, who was trying to return the Dark Knight armor. Keep it until I made you something better, Seth told him tiredly. Although they were all in a terrible condition and tired to the bones, this unexpected trip had really welded them together into a party. Seth decided to make their equipment wholeheartedly, no strings attached. Well, they still had to pay for it. But did working it off with their bodies really count? Thank you, Tekker said touched. He had felt really powerful wearing this armor. Okay guy, you should all return home for now. I am in favor of taking a good long break after this nightmare. A tired yay came from the party members who split up and scuffed away. Didn't you forget something, said the one member still with him. Al. Can we please not do this? I'm really tired. This just means you can't resist, she answered with a spark in her eyes. She laughed in the next moment seeing Seth's wronged face. Just gimme money and I will go plunder a restaurant or something. I won't force you, today. Seth hurriedly shoved a bundle of bills in her arms and ran off towards the system church. The sorceress would simply vanish once her time was up, so it was no problem for them to split up. The encounter with the 200-year-old predator gave him the adrenaline rush he needed to get back to the church. The night staff looked at him with wide eyes when he suddenly stumbled into the foyer. He used a church token to use the magically enhanced elevator to his apartment. He had been gone for quite some time and there were people that probably wanted answers, but Seth did not care. He really just wanted to hug the pillow and not wake up for another week. It was not a full week but he kept doing nothing but sleep, eat and poop for the next 3 days. After the first day, he finally told Samuel what had happened. The priest looked concerned when he heard about the foggy world. He assured Seth he would inform the guild about the third hospital. Seth also asked the church to look for the sister of the corpse they had found. Then he stopped caring about the world for the next 2 days. After replenishing his energies, Seth thought about the next steps. He warmed up with some generic armors for the next auctions. After giving away the knight's armor he needed gloves or gauntlets, pauldrons, greaves and boots to complete his armor again. Originally, he planned to make the boots with the white bull hide but he was uncertain now that he knew that the material bore the curse. He was lucky the first time but he might not be as lucky the second time. For the gloves, he needed to write Natal, or find a tailor on Earth. He hoped to get another boost on his firepower with a glove of celestial bronze as the base. Seth had decided to specialize a little more on his pyrokinesis, since it was his only special attack skill. Seth sighed and put away a finished uncommon breastplate. He simply lacked the thing he could have had easy access to in Aura. Did he really have to relocate to Delta, so he could get regular access to the auction house? He had heard that the road there had become rather dangerous and cumbersome after the apocalypse. Before there had been many roads and railroad lines that connected Delta, Epsilon and Beta through a network of tunnels in the extensive mountain range. This network had become unusable. People trying to traverse them had simply vanished. The only usable routes were those that led across the surface of the mountains. Side roads, maintenance ways, and ancient dilapidated trade routes. On top came the monsters that had appeared in the mountains and made them their home. They did not bother to leave the mountains but they didn't say no to prey that visited them in their territory. Reports of mutated eagles, tribes of orcs and mountain trolls, the Yeti so on and so forth, all kinds of wild stories were circulated and many were coming from the mailman that was responsible for the sparse communication between the districts. To sum it up, the journey was not very comfortable and Seth knew from experience that traveling across mountains was not really his thing. Accepting that he currently lacked the things for the stuff he really wanted to make, he opted for a set of rare equipment made from mithril and dark steel as substitutes. They were also a good test for the new souls he had acquired. They were all uncommon and seemed to have an effect related to the mind. He only knew the full potential after using them a little. First, he made a gauntlet using a medium-sized soul from the monsters. Mind Gauntlet. Rare. Damage, 280. Physical Def, 415. Mag Def, 285. Durability, 1800. 1 plus 10% mana regeneration in darkness. 2 plus 20% resistance to negative status effects, mind. 335% chance to cause mental disruption on hit, effects, stun/confusion. 4 plus 120 mana. A gauntlet made by Journeyman Smith and imbued with peculiar effects using special means. Just infusing the soul already brought 2 special effects that would have counted as complicated enchantments if he had to engrave them on the item. That was ignoring the fact that he did not even know the circuit for those. Looking at the effect of these souls gave Seth a good idea for Tekker's items. With these souls, there was the possibility to turn their useless tank in one terrifying weapon of crowd control. Thinking of the equipment for his party was a welcome distraction at this point. For Allison. Seth was no tailor but he still had his padded jacket made of ancient bronze. Maybe he could ask Alzalsa to enchant it for him. If not, he could still infuse one of the new souls into it. And for the gourmet hunter, Seth bet that Link would appreciate a cooking knife made of mithril. Jokes aside, Seth wanted to talk with the hunter before deciding. Right now, Link was using a bow, but maybe Seth could convince him to change to a crossbow? Using the magic steel and these new souls, he might be able to create a wicked crossbow. After a quick tangent, Seth ended up thinking about his own equipment again. There was another kind of soul he needed to check, the ones dropped by the Tuatha. Big and uncommon meant they had an effect and gave somewhere around 1000 mana. Seth made a gauntlet from magic steel and infused one of the big souls into it. Thaumatic Gauntlet. Rare. Damage, 230. Physical Def, 355. Mag Def, 570. Durability, 2000. 1 plus 30% mana regeneration. 2 plus 900 mana. 3. Casting time is reduced by 25%. A gauntlet made by Journeyman Smith and imbued with peculiar effects using special means. Seth was shocked by the effects of the soul. Those glow people must have been the born magic users. And this was just the effect an uncommon soul. What could a rare soul from them do? This reminded Seth of a thought he had a long while back. Could he upgrade the rating of souls by fusing them? Back then he could only try with common souls, but now he had a whole bunch of uncommon souls. Even if they did not upgrade, wouldn't their effects grow stronger if he fused the same kinds of uncommon souls? Chapter 170. Strength of a Soul. Seth had 17 small uncommon souls and 302 common small souls. It was enough for experimenting a little. First, Seth made an item with a small uncommon soul to see what its effects were after infusion. The effects were similar to that of the medium-sized soul but much weaker, giving 5% resistance to mind-based status effects and a 5% chance to cause the mind disruption effect. Next, he used 13 common souls to upgrade a small uncommon soul into a medium-sized one. When he made another gauntlet with this soul, he found that the effects could not compare to the one that had originally dropped as a medium-sized soul. The new mind gauntlet only gave 15% resistance and a 23% chance to trigger the mind disruption. Seth had a theory, so he tried fusing some of the small uncommon souls into the new mind gauntlet. He could observe the effects strengthening further with each soul until it even surpassed the previous one after he infused 2 more uncommon souls. He guessed that just using common souls to bolster uncommon ones would have a limited effect. After some point it might end up just diluting the soul and weakening the effect, but what about the resentful soul in his bow? It had just kept getting stronger, despite him using common souls to bolster it. Or had he been weakening it? He was brooding over this when he remembered that he had an expert for this with him. Diluting a soul? That sounds dumb. You are looking at this a little too simple. All souls differ, and I presume these effects that you can infuse using the souls are the properties inherited from the individuals they once were. There are stronger and weaker beings out there. There is no diluting, it's simply that there is a limit to the properties one soul can have. You can also see that in how your skill rates them. It's still just a soul, despite being rated uncommon. On the other hand, you have stuff like your loyal soul. Seth understood. Even with all the resources in the world, a simple man would not become an immortal. But a genius will keep growing the more resources you feed them. Special souls like the resentful or the loyal soul were geniuses. They would just keep powering up, the bigger they became. As for those that were not geniuses, Seth was sure he was on the right track. Even if they could not become immortals, they could rival them with the strength of numbers. If he just kept fusing together uncommon souls, maybe they would turn into a rare one. And so, he started fusing together the small uncommon souls. His will wavered after the 5th soul, but he kept going. But the soul had not upgraded, even after he had fused together all 12 souls he had left. At this point, did it still matter? Seth extracted the small soul from the item and fused it, too. Then he fused the result into the gauntlet with the medium-sized soul he had made. No upgrade. 17 souls. He had just merged 17 uncommon souls into one, but there was no visible change. But its potential had to be amazing, right? There was no way, this was not amazing, right? The upper limit had to be extreme, right? To save his efforts, Seth fell into a frenzy of fusing small common souls into it to power up the item effect. Mind Gauntlet. Uncommon. Damage, 230. Physical Def, 390. Mag Def, 470. Durability, 1500. 1 plus 45% resistance to negative status effects, Mind. 355% chance to cause mental disruption on hit, effects, stun/confusion. 4 plus 775 mana. A steel gauntlet made by Journeyman Smith and imbued with peculiar effects using special means. Considering it was a steel gauntlet, to begin with, its performance had greatly risen after the infusion of almost 60 small souls, and the effects of the soul were almost double that of the simple medium-sized one, but this was simply a waste of resources. Seth admitted it with tears in his eyes. Considering how many items he could have made by just strengthening the individual souls, the simple man had disappointed him. Even in numbers, they could not compare to a genius. The genius. Seth's eyes lit up. This was the only way he could cover his losses. The experiment was not over yet. He extracted the soul from the gauntlet and repaired it with 3 more small souls. And then he started infusing medium-sized souls until it became a soul, big, crafting material, uncommon. Alright, let's see what will happen. He brought out the cursed bow of decay. The resentful soul was still rated uncommon, even after becoming big. Maybe it would make a growth spurt after injecting it with a whole dose of other uncommon souls. Even if it did not, just adding the mind disruption on top of the curse would be terrifying. When Seth started infusing the soul into the bow, it was the first time he felt a resistance during a soul infusion. He could not simply push the soul in and have them fuse like before. He did not understand the theory of what Al had told him, but if souls were like people, there was probably a rate of compatibility. That was what it felt like to him. Seth had to be the matchmaker then. He had to bring these two strangers together and make them one. "Call me Dr. Love, here we go," he mumbled, and felt weird to think this way about the souls of a woman and a tentacle monster. He overcame this numb feeling in his stomach, shrugged, and continued. Merging the souls was like solving a puzzle blindfolded. He had to try and mix and see what fit and stuck. It cost a huge amount of mental energy, and Seth could feel the sweat running down his face. His sense of time was long lost. Finally. Ding! You have succeeded in fusing 2 incompatible souls and created a rare soul. Soul infusion has leveled up. He succeeded. With great relief, he took a step back and looked at the upgraded bow. Mind decay. Unique. Damage, 650. Durability, 2600. 1 arrows shot with this bow show great malice and will aim to hit vital points. 2 inflicted wounds will cause terrifying pain, won't heal naturally but start decaying, have a high chance of infection and poisoning. 360% chance to cause mind disruption on hit, effects, stun/confusion/terror. 5-10% chance to cause mind decay on hit. 6 plus 450 mana. A terrifying weapon made by the devious hands of Journeyman Smith. A bow possessed by a malicious will to hurt its benefactor's enemies and torment them. If someone other tries to use this bow, they will be hit by the curse of decay in body and mind. Usage requirements: Seth Smith, 90 strength. These were the effects, and he had not even come up with what enchantments he wanted to add on top of it. The effect of mind decay was literally to slowly have the mind of the target rot away. This was the description when he looked at the system window. He had no idea how far this effect would go, but it sounded quite terrifying. The basic attributes of the bow had also gained a boost. After fusing 2 big souls, there was also finally some mana left over. A loud noise echoes through the room. His stomach signaled to him that it was time for food. He took a deep breath and stored the bow away before leaving his apartment. Chapter 171. Some peace. A scrumptious meal and this success alleviated Seth's mood enough that he was ready to deal with the less fun stuff in life, human interaction. He sat down and wrote not only a letter to Nadal, consulting about the gloves, he also wrote one to Tord to confront him with the fact that the leather was, in fact, cursed. He had calmed down enough, and doubted that Tord would knowingly harm him. Maybe someone had even tried to harm Tord with this leather. Something this underhanded was not the style of dwarves, so who would pull off something like that? It was not Seth's place to get involved anymore, but he wrote to Tord to inform him at least. It was also a good excuse to never pay for the surplus materials he took from the dwarf. Maybe he should extort some more from his master. No, it was okay. He also answered the letter of little Rena he had saved during his time on the airship. What concerned him a little, as he thought about his correspondence, was that there was no letter from Finn or the party. He hoped they were doing okay. It would be a shame if he managed to build a place for them here and they ended up lost in some dungeon or battlefield. Next was Samuel. He wanted to talk to him about the next auction and about the quest he had picked up. Seth had left looking for the sister to the church while he was lazing around recuperating from his arduous adventure. When she left his room, he came across two moderately cute girls that were happily chatting with each other as they walked down the hallway. "Mary, Jane," he called out to the two employees he had picked up. "Seth, you are finally up?" Jane asked him, surprised. They had not seen their masked employer for almost 2 weeks. Mary kept a little in the back, still a little shy. "Haha, yeah. I neglected you guys a little recently, haven't I?" "Oh. Please don't worry about it. Life here is very quiet and enjoyable. There is not much more we could wish for." Seth nodded, satisfied. "What are you guys up to?" "We were going to grab some food. Want to come along?" How could Seth say no to food? He had eaten not long ago. How could Seth say no to food? That was why Seth made a detour and spent some time with his employees at the church canteen before looking for Samuel. He knocked on a big door at one of the top floors of the church building. It had been the office of some big-shot CEO at one point, as far as Seth had heard. He waited for Samuel to invite him in before he stepped into the enormous office. It was very minimalistic, with lots of empty space and a tiny-looking desk before a giant window in the back. "Seth? Take a seat. Would you like some tea?" Seth sat down opposite of Samuel and accepted the tea gratefully. They started off talking about the next auction. Instead of just one kind of weapon, they would offer a few different kinds and 2 suits of armor. The reception of the last auction had been great and they were expecting almost double the number of people to come during the next one. Seth used the opportunity to complain a little about the church's ability to get materials. It really wasn't that they could not get his stuff, it was that they were penny pinchers, so they took their sweet time to get his stuff somewhere at a cheap price and rip him off with the price it would have in the auction. Samuel acted apologetically, but he did not make any promises to correct their way. He was a sly old man. Once they were done deciding about the contents of the next auction, Seth came to the last reason he came for. "Did you find her?" he asked about the sister, Evie. They had not found her yet. From what the church had originally found out from the government documents, she was a 17-year-old by now and once lived with her brother in Maibo, a satellite city close to Y City. After her brother vanished, she went to live with her aunt in Arigiri, another satellite city at the coast where Y City's big river entered the Great Lake and then the ocean. That's where the lead broke off, since this satellite city was overrun by the Mer people in the early days of the apocalypse. There were no more records of her afterward. Which was mostly that the leadership was still recovering even now. There were more pressing matters than thoroughly registering all kinds of refugees. So, even if that city where she was supposed to be was overrun, she was not necessarily dead. Many people died back then, but many also managed to escape. There actually was a good chance that she managed to escape. Samuel already sent people to look for refugees from that area and see whether people knew of what happened to her. This was all they could do for now. If this led to nothing, they would have to hire a diviner to find her whereabouts, if she was alive. Seth sighed. "Samuel, you seem to forget, I am the one paying. Get a diviner to do some work right now. Who knows, she might be dead by the time you slowpokes find a clue." The world was in constant change. The life of a random teen could end any day with simple bad luck. It was not Seth being a concerned adult. He wanted the quest reward. After his recent experiment, the Wanderer's soul became much more valuable. It had a descriptor. This meant it was a genius. These were the souls with the potential to stay with Seth until the end. Of course, their specific abilities mattered, but in the end, it depended on Seth and how he was able to utilize them. But to utilize them he needed to get his hands on them. So, he needed the girl alive and well. Samuel nodded. "All right, I will call for a diviner to look for the girl." "Great." It would take a few days to get a professional diviner to come to Earth, so Seth had time on his hands. Seth decided to finish the items for the auction and for his party. This way they could soon start dungeon diving and leveling like crazy. He sent a messenger to them to invite them for a meeting, where he could finalize their item wishes. Until then, he made the auction items and things he definitely wanted to make. He recreated the Mind Gauntlet and the Thalmatic Gauntlet using Mithril, Dark Steel and the Smithing Ballad that would be able to reflect part of the damage, and went with flat attribute increases when it came to the enchantments. Both came out as epic. Thalmatic Gauntlet. Epic. Damage, 250. Physical Def, 370. Mag Def, 590. Durability, 2000. 1 plus 10% mana regeneration in darkness. 2 plus 30% mana regeneration. 3. Casting time is reduced by 25%. 4 plus 35 intelligence. 5 plus 35 willpower. 6. 15% of the received damage will be reflected to the attacker. 7 plus 10% darkness resistance. 8 plus 850 mana. A gauntlet made by Journeyman Smith and imbued with peculiar effects using special means. The dream of any warrior/mage hybrid. Mind Gauntlet. Epic. Damage, 280. Physical Def, 415. Mag Def, 285. Durability, 2000. 1 plus 10% mana regeneration in darkness. 2 plus 20% resistance to negative status effects, mind. 3 35% chance to cause mental disruption on hit, effects, stun/confusion. 4 plus 35 strength. 5 plus 35 dex. 6 20% of the received damage will be reflected to the attacker. A gauntlet made by Journeyman Smith and imbued with peculiar effects using special means. They looked like the opposite to the items of the Dark Knight set as they had a silver color with dark elements and designs on them. Seth created a pair of boots and greaves in a similar style, but he refrained from using soles on them. With the wyvern armor scale skirt going way past his knee, he did not really fear someone attacking his feet. Even if he could extract soles, they would still become slightly damaged and needed to be repaired with other soles. He rather saved the soles for other things. He had already splurged a little on the 2 gauntlets. When he looked out the window, he found that it was already dark outside. He decided this much was enough and went to sleep. His party would come early tomorrow for the meeting. Chapter 172. Some peace, too. The next morning, he was woken by the bright sunlight. He was glad to live at the church right now since he could simply visit the canteen and eat as much as he wanted. Late morning, when he was done with his breakfast, the party members started to slowly arrive and sat down with him at his table. Mary and Jane also joined when they saw the group sitting around Seth. He planned to work with all of them in the future, so he was happy that they got along without any problems. After breakfast, they went back into that meeting room, where they had first met. I asked you all to come by because I wanted to talk about your equipment. We already spent some time with each other in something others might call a life or death situation. I got a rough idea, but I did not want to ignore your preferences. I actually really like this Dark Knight set. Tecker was the first who spoke up. He was scratching his cheek embarrassed. He was sure that asking for this full set of rare armor was too much, but maybe Seth could make him something similar? But Seth just sat there and nodded while thinking. He had already planned to leave the set to Tecker, simply because it was not as useful if the full set could not be worn. That's good, then I only need to make you a better weapon and shield. Actually, I had an interesting idea. You don't have any good sword skills or something like that, right? The big man blushed and nodded. He barely managed to gain swordsmanship level 1. How about we focus on your class's advantages and you use 2 shields? Since you can't deal much damage no matter what, let's max out your defensive power. We have others for the damage. Tecker nodded relieved. He had also thought of this in the very beginning, but since he lacked any kind of taunt skills, he had to use a weapon to provoke monsters. It was different with Seth around. He could simply make items that fit him and fixed this weakness. Listening to their conversation gave Allison the courage to also speak up. I know a blacksmith is probably not versed in making stuff like robes or hats, but could you maybe make me accessories that buff agility and casting speed? I finally managed to learn mobile chanting yesterday, which allows me to move while chanting. But my agility is non-existent. This surprised Seth. She explained that she had tried hard the last few days because of the experiences in their week together. She had used her skill points to level up her chanting and ended up gaining mobile chanting. Seth still had the padded jacket as an ace up his sleeve, but he asked. So where would you get good robes then, if not from me? There is actually a famous apprentice tailor in Y City who manages to make uncommon equipment once in a while. I have been saving up money to get a robe and hat from there. Seth was a little surprised that there actually was an apprentice tailor in Y City. On the other hand, they definitely had more than enough time. It was good that she could get a hat on her own. Maybe they could get a good one from the dungeons, too. I have a good cloth armor for you, so use that money to get a good hat. As for the accessories, I will try to make you something that increases your agility, 2. Me next. Link suddenly broke out. He was the only one left anyways, why did he have to act like this? We have to hunt a little in the next few days, I would like some better leather for your equipment. The gourmet hunter's expression turned when it sounded like he was the only one who had to wait. Tekker already had his armor and Seth already had Allison's cloth armor, only he would need to wait until their next hunt or longer. But I have a suggestion I wanted to talk to you about. Your weapon skill is marksman, right? Link nodded surprised. What was Seth getting at? That means you could also use stuff like muskets or crossbows, right? Another nod. Would you change to a crossbow? I have a really cool idea for a wicked crossbow. The hunter's eyes lit up and he excitedly agreed. It was good that he was not attached to using the bow. It had been a good idea to speak with him before he went ahead with making the items. How would he have known that Allison had managed to learn mobile chanting? Seth had no problem supplying them with accessories. He still had a badge he originally wanted to sell in his shop. They were just generic enchantments, but they were all rare rated and would more than suffice for now. For Allison's robe, he decided to sacrifice one of the big souls from the Hwatha. Using spirit forging he shaped the big soul into a shape similar to the padded golden jacket. He had learned from experience, that the closer he got the soul to the shape of the item he would infuse it to, the less loss there was. It was something he had to accept. When he infused a soul into an item, there was always a slight loss in the power of the soul. But when he used spirit forging he could reduce the loss, the more precise he worked. It was just that it was quite hard to forge intricate details into a metaphysical item like a soul. Seth guessed that it would become easier once the skill level increased. Once he had forged a spirit jacket he used the soul engraver to enchant it with automatic sizing and agility. The reason why he did not choose any overly powerful enchantments was simple, the simple effects of the soul were already the most beneficial for their wizard. A huge increase in her mana pool was together with the inherent effects of the soul was already more than enough. Like Nadal had said back then, the jacket was not far off an epic item, and with the infusion of the soul, the outcome was an epic caster item. Golden Mage Robe. Epic. Physical DEF, 530. Mag DEF 570. Durability 3000. 1 Strength and Defense by 45% for 10's mana cost 70. 2 Weight of the armor is halved no cost. 3 plus 30% mana regeneration. 4 Casting time is reduced by 25%. 5 plus 950 mana. 6 Automatic sizing. 7 plus 35 agility. A high-quality cloth armor made by the experienced hands of tailor craftsman Nadal. Excellent weaving and sewing techniques imbued this item with overwhelming performance and effects. Special treatment by Blacksmith Journeyman Smith has imbued the item with peculiar powers. If Seth was a mage or had plans to become one, he would probably not give this away. He was sure this would give their wizard a great boost in power and survivability. For Tekker's shields, Seth chose to make something similar to his wyvern shield. For the first time in a long while he used Blueprint's function to design them. They were bigger than a regular buckler but smaller than a full-size round shield. On top of the shield boss, he added a long vicious spike, so Tekker could deal more damage with attacks like charge or shield bash. As the main material, he chose dark steel, not just because it fits well with the armor. The material had good compatibility with the dark element and dark magic. This made it a good base for enchantments that would give nefarious negative status effects. Seth wanted to make the tank as annoying as possible to an enemy. During the forging, Seth used a demonic ballad he had avoided so far. Alzalsa had not taught him many different ballads and some he had avoided because their price was too high. This ballad's effect was very similar to the mind disruption that the monster souls were able to inflict. The range of mind-based status ailments was a little wider, but the price of the effect was that the user himself also needed to withstand the demonic corruption. It made the enchanted quite literally a cursed or demonic item like Seth had always read about in novels. Seth's worries were alleviated by the inherent effects of the monster souls to grant resistance. Using this to counteract the cursed effect he infused a medium-sized uncommon soul into each of the shields. Seth used the 2 snake fangs, that had been aging in his inventory, to forge the shield spikes. The spike's shape would lend itself to pierce armor and cause bleeding. He added a deadly poison enchantment, the more intricate version of a simple poison enchantment, to add another layer of status effects. As a second enchantment, he chose shield for one and agility for the other. He finished the first shield in the evening after their meeting. He infused another 2 medium-sized common souls to max out the effects of the souls. Cursed Fang Shield. Rare. Damage, 225. Physical Def, 532. Mag Def, 320. Durability, 2200. 1 plus 10% mana regeneration in darkness. 2 plus 10% darkness resistance. 3 plus 25% resistance to negative status effects, mind. 4 40% chance to cause mental disruption on hit, effects, stun/confusion. 5 25% chance to cause fear/confusion/stupor/sleep/vertigo/blindness/silence/. 6 20% chance to cause bleeding. 7 10% chance to inflict deadly poison status effect. 8 plus 35 agility. A cursed shield made by the hands of Journeyman Smith imbued with a row of terrifying effects. It owes its name to the long spike protruding from its center like the fang of a monster. The item may eat away at the wielder's sanity if he lacks a strong will. Seth deliberated and decided that he would use the ballad for reflection on the second shield, so the burden on Tekker's mind would not become too overwhelming. With that, he ended his day and went for a late dinner. Chapter 173 Some Peace, 3. Seth took the freedom to oversleep the next morning. Although the work in the smithy was fun, it was still hard work. There was no need for him to hurry or anything. He had no plans to off on adventures before the diviner arrived. Who knew with what kind of situation Seth would have to deal with, once they found the girl. One possibility to end the quest Seth could think of was that he would need to retrieve the girl's corpse from the demolished and mer-people-infested city ruins. There was nothing out of the ordinary this morning, Sochi got back and finished the second shield after laying siege to the canteen. Like he had decided the other day, the second shield was not cursed, but did not lag behind in anything. Fang Shield. Rare. Damage, 225. Physical Def, 532. Mag Def, 320. Durability, 2200. 1 plus 10% mana regeneration in darkness. 2 plus 10% darkness resistance. 3 plus 25% resistance to negative status effects, mind. 4 40% chance to cause mental disruption on hit, effects, stun/confusion. 5 creates active skill, shield. 6 20% chance to cause bleeding. 7 10% chance to inflict deadly poison status effect. 8 20% of received damage is reflected. An offensive shield made by the hands of Journeyman Smith imbued with a row of terrifying effects. It owes its name to the long spike protruding from its center like the fang of a monster. Active skill, shield cost, 100 mana cooldown 5 minutes. Creates a shield with 500 durability around the user that lasts for 1 minute. The shield skill was similar to the one on his Wyvern shield, but was slightly worse and fueled by the wielder's mana. With these two shields, the tank would become a nightmare for their enemies. With this, it did not matter that the tank could not deal much damage or taunt the enemy. He just needed to jump in and back people with the shield. With this many options, it would be a wonder if he did not inflict at least one negative status effect on the opponent. The worst thing that could hit an enemy was probably a mix of them. Especially the deadly poison. Was a dreadful enchantment. Unlike the simple poison enchantment, this poison would not stop until an antidote was applied or a priest purified the victim. Although the strength would lessen over time, if left unattended it could lead to death. Even Tekker could win a fight of attrition using this. If he gained some points in luck, he might even be able to stun lock opponents. Seth took a break for the rest of the day. Looking back, he had really managed to finish a lot since the meeting. He could still make that crossbow tomorrow. Thinking about what to do with his break, Seth decided to take a stroll through the city. He was not opposed to just spending the day in bed, but it felt a little cramped after spending several days without going outside. Since he came to Y City he had never really taken his time to take a good look at the city. He invited Mary and Jane to accompany him on his stroll, but they declined. They had decided to join the church and took up a strict training regime with one of the priests. Seth had no idea what had gotten into them, but he did not mind. The stronger his employees became, the harder it would be for people to rob his store. All alone the young man left the church and entered the crowded streets of Y City. Seth could feel that he had changed. Even so, he was alone in this mass of people, he did not mind it. He still remembered how stressed he had felt back in Starta with just a few townspeople on the streets. Now it almost did not bother him. Looking around the city, it seemed almost normal. Stores were open all along the streets, people were on break or on their way back to work. Some others were also just strolling and window shopping like him. It did not feel like the world had changed much. Except for the obvious changes, of course. There were no cars on the streets, people wore all kinds of colorful fantasy equipment. The shops and stores had changed from displaying stylish fashion to stylish, but crappy, armors and items. But the modern clothes had not vanished. There was still normal streetwear and stylish clothes mixed in. Seth could see that these were made by skill holders and had a tiny bit of effect like increased durability. The jobs of people had also adjusted and adapted to the new setting and classes. All in all, society did a good job of not devolving into a bunch of raiders fighting over the last scraps of civilization. Seth's only regret was, that the shops and stores had no use for him. Materials sold to the public were just common stuff that was barely enough for the crafting professions to grind their skills. In his opinion, it confirmed his decision to go and learn the basics in a different world. From what Seth could see, the apprentice tailor Allison had mentioned was probably among the top of crafters in Y City. As an apprentice, he would be barely able to work with uncommon materials. But even if he could, it did not mean there was even a supply of uncommon materials for him. As he aimlessly walked around the city, he more and more often came across posters of adventurers in supposedly awesome-looking armors. They were advertisements of various guilds that recruited people to join them. Since every citizen was a player, it meant anyone could take up the job of being an adventurer. Of course, this did not mean everyone wanted to. Some also talked about the Hunter Association, which was established by the leadership. They even advertised that they would provide equipment befitting the player's level and class. As Seth thought about it, not only did the government do its best to hoard good items and talented people, but they also collected quite a lot of materials via those shops. The best crafters in Y City were probably public officials or hidden by other factions like the guilds that supplied them with items. Having others provide him oodles and noodles of materials to grind his skills. It was a shame that it was not an option for Seth. These factions simply lacked the strength to provide Seth with the resources he needed. That's why he needed to do it himself. It made more sense for Seth to just found his own faction, since he probably was the biggest amalgamation of high-level skills and precious material currently walking around on Earth. Good thing nobody knew that he would drop better stuff than a small dragon if he was killed. Since there were tamed beasts for cargo transport here and there, he guessed that it was okay to have your pets out. Seth decided to bring out Puffles and plunder the street stalls with him. It had been a while since they just spent time together. Seth actually ended up buying a lot of small souvenirs and knickknacks. This had nothing to do with survival or making big money, but he felt like having some fun with these in the future. On his way back, they came across a big crowd of gawking people. They are coming out. Is that really Squad 1? Wow, it's Squad 1. Look at that armor. They say it's rare. Are you for real? Timothy, I want your child, a middle-aged man in his late 40s screamed. Thinking of what he screamed, maybe it was a woman. Seth had a hard time judging. When his mind finally recovered, he looked at the people that left the portal-type dungeon. Their items were a mismatched mix of mostly uncommon and 1 or 2 rare items. They were not pretty to look at, but the overall performance was outstanding in comparison to Y City's standards. Squad 1, he mused about what the people called them. His conclusion was that these were likely people from the Hunter Association, and the items were probably bought in the auction house. He was curious and brought out the token from his inventory. Hey, Al, can you take a look at them? Are they special? Oh, now you remember me? When you need me, you bring me out, and if you don't, you just leave me in the inventory. I have feelings too, you know? I'm sorry, okay? I forgot. I definitely did not leave you in the inventory on purpose to enjoy the silence or anything like that. Grr. Just you wait. No, they are not too special. They have rare classes, but rather ordinary ones. They have potential, but I don't think they are a big loss. Seth nodded. He trusted her judgment, even though she was a little grumpy at the moment. If she said, those guys were not a loss, then he did not care any further. He turned around and got on his way back to the church. He had walked a few steps when he heard someone calling from behind. Chapter 174. Squashed 1. Hey you, is that your pet? The crowd split, and one of the people that had been surrounded by it stepped forward. He wore puffy leather armor with fur elements, and his well-toned arms were bandaged in leather straps. He was pointing at Puffles, who was at this point almost as tall as Seth and happily munching on a bunch of meat skewers. The eye visor had a growth spurt during the week they spent in the fog world. Even so, it had not leveled up, the caterpillar had become bigger and stronger. Seth had made the mistake to look back to see what was going on. The guy took this as his affirmation that Puffles was his pet. "What is your level?" he kept asking rudely. Seth turned away and wanted to ignore him, but then he felt the itch of an appraisal skill on himself. "Hat. Just level 27. This pet is wasted on you. I'm the Beastmaster Cedric from the Hunter Association's Squad 1. I will pay you a good price for this creature if you hand it over. With my skills, I can truly bring out its potential." It was not just Seth, even Puffles was baffled, looking at him monologuing like a jerk. Seth, who always tried to see the best in people, fathomed that this guy might have a mental disability. Since it was probably rude to call him out on this, he decided again to ignore him and leave. "Are we really leaving this pest? The great me feels peeved to let this go." It was rude to just appraise someone else, but he really could not blame a handicapped person. Seth whispered to Puffles and it understood his intentions. He was being the bigger man here. "Hey, where do you think you are going when I'm talking to you? Didn't you hear what I said? I'm from Squad 1. How much do you want for your pet? Hey, are you retarded? I'm talking to you." He grabbed for Seth's shoulder and the next moment he was squashed under Puffles' massive hard-shelled body. Seth could be the bigger man, but why? Puffles was already the greatest, so why hold back? It was Seth's turn to use observation, though it did not give him a lot. "Cedric Hall, leave 35. Get it off me, you pleb. How dare you attack a member of Squad 1? He was still very talkative and kept complaining and blaming like a child. Despite Puffles being more than 10 levels lower, he easily overwhelmed the player. "Cedric? We are leaving. What is going on here?" A group of young people had finally followed the Beastmaster, led by a young and charismatic-looking magic swordsman. Wow, they really looked like a generic hero party from a comic book. Just that their equipment was ugly and mismatched. But hey, only performance matters, right? Behind the leader was a high priestess, a sorcerer, a scout, a guardian, and a shadow thief. They did not just look like a generic party, their stat distribution was too. As if following an online guide, they all focused on 2 or 3 attributes at most. They completely ignored the rest. Just like most would in an page. The information was conveniently supplied by Alzalsa in form of sarcastic remarks. The man in the front took in the scene before him and Seth could see the resignation on his face. "Not again," he mumbled while face-palming. The party members in the back also looked rather annoyed. With a sigh, the leader stepped forward. "Hello, I'm Kai, the leader of Squad 1. I apologize for my useless party member's rude behavior and hope you could forgive him this one time." This already seemed studied. Did this guy act up so often? "Kai? What are you saying? I only said that I could make much better use of this pet kya." One of Puffles' scythes had dug deep into the Beastmaster's shoulder. "Cure. Vermin like you has no right to talk like that." "It's right. Shut up, you beast crazy maniac. I've had enough of your bull hmph." The High Priestess had started to rant from the back but was silenced by the Guardian's massive hand. "Lena, stop it. It's bad enough Cedric acts so shameful in public. Sir, please forgive him and let him go. I'm sure there is a non-violent way to solve this," the leader pleaded sincerely. Looking at the chaotic group of players, Seth judged a fight to be unlikely. He had already had a plan to subdue them. Since none of them had a lot of points in willpower, it would have been easy to flatten them with dragon might. Alas, it was not necessary for now. He had a better idea to solve it. These people had just left the dungeon, maybe he could ask for some materials from them. But how to go about it? Brute force, what was there to lose? Sure. There is an easy way to solve this. I don't need money, but I'm a crafter class and you probably saw how hard it is to get good materials around here. Maybe you could reimburse me with rare material? I would appreciate leather specifically, he said with a huge business smile. The party blinked, even Cedric was a little surprised by this turn of events. What Seth did not know was that rare materials were practically worthless at the moment. The government hoarded them for the time when the crafting classes got that far, but at the moment those things were simply stored away somewhere. This made Seth's offer the more enticing solution. Nobody in the Hunter Association would miss some rare leather, but the party would be hard-pressed if they had to reimburse him with their own money. On the other hand, it was also slightly suspicious that a crafter asked for a material he probably could not process. Seth didn't really get their confusion and just kept waiting for an answer. It created a convenient misunderstanding in the party's minds. Seth chose this option because he knew it and he gave them face by offering an easy solution. Their hearts warmed at the thought that there were still good people like Seth in this city. Well, except Cedric's, who got closer and closer to death due to blood loss. We have 2 kinds of rare leather, will these suffice? The leader brought out 2 large sheets of leather. One was thin and grey while the other was very thick and brown. Ground ape chest leather, crafting material, rare. The leather of a ground ape's chest area where he would drum with his fist to activate his skill shockwave. High affinity with earth element. Killer bat wing leather, crafting material, rare. The wing leather of a killer bat, known to kill its prey with sonic waves. Good affinity with wind element and darkness. Yes, these are great. Thank you very much, Seth said joyfully, and Puffles got off of the Beastmaster. Unwillingly, the High Priestess started healing Cedric while Seth said his goodbyes and left. What a fortuitous encounter, Seth thought to himself as he returned to the church. He had gotten a bunch of leather for Link's armor, without working for it. Maybe he should leave the house more often? Seth shook his head. He reminded himself that the city might seem peaceful, but this world was not a big orchard where he could go around and just pick fruits. It was an orchard with venomous snakes hiding between the fruits. It was best he stayed in a workshop, instead of the battlefield. Yes, safety came first. It was definitely not, because he wanted to laze around. Chapter 175. The diviner arrived. Seth used the acquired materials wisely and finished the equipment for the gourmet hunter and what he himself was still missing. He used most of the bat leather for Link's armor. It was a quite traditional design of a hardened leather armor that still offered a big range of movement. Seth did not really like leather working. His skills made the crafting process not much faster, which meant it took much longer than forging. As he was stitching, boiling, and waxing the armor and its different parts, his thoughts wandered. Yesterday, he had seen once again that most technology had vanished. In this silent moment, he started thinking of the why. Because in Alpha his phone and kitchen appliances and really everything else had worked just fine after the apocalypse, even the motorbike he had found had no trouble running. Maybe he was just paranoid, but he could not avoid the question that maybe there was some catastrophe still waiting to happen. Compared to other districts he had heard, Y City was really quiet, except for the invasion from the ocean. Although he heard that Beta and Delta had the same problem, this did not mean anything. Maybe all 3 districts would suddenly explode or something. His thought did not really get anywhere while he sat there and crafted the armor, but he decided to ask Samuel when he got the chance. Whatever it was, Seth was sure Samuel would also have a book like Simon, that contained the worst scenarios their world had to offer and how to avoid them. His wandering thoughts stopped when he heard the notification that he had finished the items. He had finished Link's leather armor and boots for himself. The armor included cuirass, greaves, bracers, and pauldrons. It was a shame that the ability of Karen's obelisk and energy circulation too could not be used to harden leather. At least he could use reinforcement, the skill he had gotten after energy circulation upgraded, to increase the armor performance and durability a little. Seth sighed. This was as far as his ability in leather working went. There was a reason why there were classes that specialized in this kind of work. The finished armor was of a dark grey color with a tint of violet. The rare item increased movement speed and the affinity with the wind element thanks to the material properties of the leather. Seth infused the cuirass with a medium-sized sole that increased dexterity by 70 since it was the main attribute of a hunter and a cook. He used 2 small soles to infuse into the 2 bracers which increased agility and dexterity by 10 each. It was nothing special in Seth's eyes, but it would be more than enough to serve the hunter for a long time. The most important for the glass cannon would be his weapon. For himself, Seth used the rest of the bat leather and some of the ape leather to make almost knee-high leather boots, which he armored with magic steel. The new material had opened up new possibilities. So he would replace his current boots before even using them once. He used the thick and sturdy ape leather for the soles and the softer batwing leather for the body and shaft. Seth followed Alzalsa's advice when it came to the enchantment. She said there was a good chance to build upon the fact that the ape leather was originally used for skill activation. For the enchantment, he took a medium-sized monster soul and used spirit forging to turn it into a pair of boots similar to the one he had already finished. Ding! Skill, Spirit Forging Leave 1 has become Spirit Forging Leave 2. Seth was positively surprised. He had gotten used to the idea that he would need to use SP to level his class skills. But he had actually managed to level Spirit Forging. This was a great relief, because it meant that he could level this skill, as long as he kept grinding it. He paused and immediately looked at the perk list, but Leave 2 brought no interesting new perks. He returned to the boots. Under Al's guidance, he interweaved the complex enchantments of Strength and Tremor. Tremor was an enchantment that was barely within Seth's capabilities. He actually had to buy the enchantment scroll via the church for a hefty price. Well, he got a good discount because he claimed that he would use the enchantment for the batch of weapons for the next auction. Tremor was the lesser version of Earthquake. He was used by striking the earth with one's weapon, which would create a shockwave that could disrupt the opponent's movement, skill, or chanting. It was already very complex on its own, but now he had to interweave it with the more complex version of the Strength enchantment. Without the 200-year-old sorceress giving him instructions, he might have failed miserably. His clothes were damp and sweat was running off his face when he finally heard the completion notification end. Ding! Skill, Enchantment, Journeyman, Leave 1 has become Enchantment, Journeyman, Leave 2. His skill level went up. Lately, he had not paid much attention to his proficiency, since he was prepared to level insanely slow after reaching Journeyman rank. But it was true, that he had actually managed to make quite a few epic items recently, which brought his blacksmithing close to a level up, too. Only Goldsmith had barely any proficiency yet. But that was okay, it had only upgraded recently. Seth took a deep breath and stood up, taking a small break to eat and drink. All that was left was to infuse the soul boots into the actual item and see whether Al's plan would come to fruition. A knock on the door interrupted his break. "Come in," he called. Drinking from a water bottle in large gulps, he saw a clerk enter the room. "Sir Smith, I'm here to inform you that the diviner you had asked for has arrived today," he said with a smile and his hands folded behind his back, waiting for Seth to dismiss him. "Isn't it early? Wasn't the diviner supposed to come tomorrow, or had Seth unwittingly lost his sense of time during crafting?" "Yes. The diviner supposedly finished his previous business earlier than expected and was able to arrive sooner. Do you wish to meet the person immediately, sir?" Seth thought for a moment. He didn't really know that person's situation. He just arrived here, maybe a break was needed? Did Samuel say anything? Or the diviner? "Master Samuel offered to have a meeting over dinner in the evening, sir." "That's a good idea. Please notify me again in an hour." With that, the clerk left and Seth could get back to his boots. Carefully he infused the soul boots and proceeded to dunk the pair into the water of Styx. The outcome was better than Seth had expected, maybe even better than what he had originally planned to do with the ox hide. Seeing the effect, Seth kept infusing small souls until there was no more improvement. Disruptor boots. Epic. Physical def, 530. Mag def, 256. Durability, 2800. 1 plus 15% affinity to earth element. 2 plus 20% affinity to wind element. 3 plus 10% movement speed. 4 plus 25% resistance to negative status effects, mind. 5 15% of the received damage will be reflected to the attacker. 6 creates active skill, Disruptor Wave. A pair of boots that pushed the limits of the maker's abilities. An epic item created by Journeyman Smith and imbued with an array of abilities thanks to special treatment. Active skill, Disruptor Wave, no cost, cooldown, 120s. Stomping will erupt in a shockwave disrupting movements, attacks, or chants and causing a wave of small pebbles to shoot out, causing small physical damage to the targets. Pebbles have a chance of 8% to cause mental disruption on hit, effects, stun/confusion. The skill was the synergy between the Ground Ape's original skill Shockwave and the enchantments of Tremor and increased strength that had created a whole new effect. It really seemed like a great AoE skill. The only problem Seth saw was that it did not differentiate between allies and enemies. There were no concerns as long as he was alone or in a duel, otherwise, it would probably be okay as long as he had a distance to Allison and Link. Tekker should be able to easily withstand the skill's effects. Seth was pulled out of his thought when the clerk knocked on his door once again. It was time to meet the diviner. Chapter 176. Ambiguous Divination. The clerk led Seth to a luxurious dining hall. On the table already sat two people. Samuel and a beautiful lady. Her skin was smooth and her eyes bright. Seth could not even begin to estimate her age, but she was overflowing with a mature charm. She wore an otherwise loose robe that was tightened in exactly the right places to show off her curves. Seth. Come, here. Sit down. Let me introduce you to our guest. Good evening. Seth greeted the two as he sat down. Good evening, she answered with a smile and a clear pleasant voice. Seth, this is Liza as contracted diviner of the church. It is nice to meet you, Mr. Smith. Despite her sweet voice and friendly demeanor, Seth felt nothing toward her. Literally, nothing, as if she was a robot. She felt almost ethereal or detached. Her expression made it seem as if her mind was not here, but somewhere far away. And she simply looked through the here and now. Ah, yes. Nice to meet you, Miss Liza. Seth answered awkwardly. He had no idea how he should deal with her weirdness. As such he simply concentrated on the food, while Samuel took over the part of talking. He praised her and explained that she was one of the top graduates of some magic institution and her master was a very famous augur who would often be hired by some of the highest kings of other worlds. As Seth concentrated on the food and only listened with one ear, he missed the two cracks in Liza's facade. She blushed a little embarrassed when Samuel kept praising her and recounted some of her achievements. The other was when she watched Seth decimate the dinner table's contents. It was not that he had bad manners or was a sloppy eater. Food kept vanishing before her eyes at a speed that seemed like a magic trick. And it had something disconcerting because it felt as if it always happened when she didn't pay attention. In one moment, there was a full dish of meat and rice before Seth and he ate normal, and the next time she looked it was an empty dish. And she was sure that it was only the time span of moments. As both were stumped by the other's behavior, it was Samuel's burden to carry the conversation to the main point. Finding the girl. Lady Liza needed to know as many details as possible to improve her skill's accuracy. Seth retold everything that had happened. This was also Samuel's first time hearing the full story about the brother that had been spirited away. Both, Lady Liza and the priest, were touched after he gave them the diary to read. We will finish preparations tonight and tomorrow Lady Liza will perform a divination for the girl you are looking for, Samuel said with unexpected enthusiasm. So the priests of the church were still human, eh? He tended to forget when you saw their face while making money. Liza smiled radiantly to transmit her confidence in her skills and reassure the customer. Seth felt weird, suddenly being radiantly smiled at by a beauty that felt so ethereal. Especially after retelling such a horrible story. He was looking forward to finishing the quest and seeing what rank the wandering soul would have after it was restored. This was really his biggest concern. The next day he was invited to a big hall with all kinds of symbols and diagrams drawn onto the polished floor. There was a bunch of bizarre materials placed in different circles of the magic formation that looked like monster parts and herbs. Please stand over here, the lady signaled him to stand in a big circle. He also saw the picture of Evie, the little sister, in one of the circles close by. The explanation was vague but easy to understand. This divination skill could tap into some of the data of the system and use them to search for players, as long as some kind of connection could be used as a basis. The fact that Seth had a quest to find and care for the sister meant the system had information on the sister. Lady Liza could use her skill to try and tap into that information. Once Seth was in position, she started chanting in a deep, disconcerting voice. It sounded like a deep rumbling, completely unfitting the ethereal beauty uttering it. Slowly glowing lines started to rise from the drawn circles and diagrams. They gathered together in the center of the room and formed a three-dimensional holographic map. The map showed the Y-City district before zooming and enlarging an area in the south close to the sea. That was Origiri at the coast of Humjul Lake and the place where Evie had lived with her aunt's family. After it zoomed in on the city, a huge area in the city was marked by a circle. It reminded Seth of quests in some RPGs and FPS he had played, where not a specific quest goal was marked, but a huge mission area where the player had to find or solve the objective on their own. Ding! Quest information has been updated. When Seth checked, he found the marked area among the quest information and also marked in the map of his map skill. He had never been to Origiri, so it was a big red circle in the middle of a grayed out map. When he looked up, he found that the big circled area had started changing colors between red, blue, and green. Sweat started forming on the diviner's smooth forehead as she frantically chanted. This went on for a while, but the area kept changing nonetheless. Her facade finally broke and she started wildly gesticulating and chanting. Seth could see the distress building up on her face until she fully covered her face with her hands and let out a big sigh. The color finally settled on blue. He guessed that the area was probably not supposed to be blinking like that. Quite similar to Seth's thought, the diviner soon explained. I was able to narrow down her location to this area, but her current condition is inconclusive. If she was dead, the color would be red. Green if she was alive. Blue means that my skills can't accurately discern whether she is dead or alive. I can only tell you that she is probably not fine and healthy. I'm sorry. After hearing the brother's story, she felt very invested in helping to fulfill this last wish. She had tried everything, but her skills were simply not enough to give a better divination about Evie's location. Seth bore witness to the whole process and recognized her efforts. Locating someone to this degree, with just a picture, a wallet, and a diary, was already a great result. She was a good person and definitely worth her money. He would have given her a 5-star review on Play, but he didn't think anyone would care with the current shape the world was in. How much did Seth have to pay? He just needed to give Samuel 3 of the blood drinker weapons he planned to send back to his shop in Aura. This added up to values of about 50 gold. After a moment, the light started dimming and the hologram vanished. She had cancelled her skill. The diviner looked so dejected that Seth approached her and patted her shoulder. Don't worry. This is already more than enough. We will definitely find her and bring her back thanks to your work. He tried to cheer her up. It helped a little and she put up a half-hearted smile. Her demeanor from before was gone and she seemed much more approachable. Thank you, she gave him a sweet smile. Less like a mystic master of divination and more like a clumsy but charming neighbor girl. Seth resisted the urge to pet her head. He still had no idea how old she was. He couldn't possibly pet the head of someone much older than himself, right? It's good that you are satisfied with the result. Should I prepare the information on Arigiri for you? Samuel stepped in with a big smile. He was very happy that everything had worked out in the end. It would have really hurt his heart if Seth denied paying. That would be great, thanks. I will talk with my party and we will leave as soon as the preparations are done. Chapter 177. Finish up. Seth returned to his room intent on finishing the items, so he could assemble the party tomorrow. That was quite the show. She was the real deal, you know? Al suddenly commented. I guess. I never saw a real fortune teller before. Seth said as he prepared the materials for the crossbow. Don't compare her to a fortune teller. That like calling me an illusionist or whatever you called those quacks. You should get closer to her, she could be useful in the future. He stopped for a moment to think. Getting close to a clumsy beauty who played an aloof, ethereal diviner as a job. Maybe if he got the chance later on. He shoved a piece of magic steel into the forge when he heard a knock on the door. If this was the diviner, then the coincidence was simply too great. He called for the visitor to enter and barely remembered to remove the steel from the forge. It would have been a shame if he burned a rare material because of his forgetfulness. Sir, I brought the information on Arigiri. It was a clerk sent by Samuel that brought him the information on the quest area. He took the file from the clerk and thanked him before he left. He put the file on his desk and got back to the forge. For the crossbow, Seth had created a new blueprint, since all the blueprints he had were crossbows that used wood for the body of the weapon. Using blueprint, he created a crossbow completely made from metal and bone, which was closer to a tactical crossbow as Seth had seen on the internet. He also added a modern magazine for the bolts. Imagine the power of reduced reload time coupled with a skill like multi-shot that magically doubled the bolts after shooting. Once the blueprint was finished, he got right into forging the crossbow limbs from magic steel. He used this material because magic steel was good in imbuing properties and he had a lot of it. He used the same ballad as he did on his wyvern rings so the crossbow could add curses to bolts. For the soul, he used once again a medium-sized monster soul. The process was very similar to the time when he built the hunter bow. A little more complicated, since he had to keep the soul split between the limbs and the body while singing his ballad at the same time. He used some of the rib bones from the snake for the handle scales. It was mostly for aesthetics. And similar to his own bow, he used some of the celestial bronze for the string. He was glad that the system simplified many of the crafting processes like heat treatment and quenching. Otherwise, it would have taken Seth quite long to produce something similar to spring steel. Since Seth was already largely used to the materials and the construction, he did not have to spend too long on the crossbow. He carved the enchantments onto the limbs. To enchant the crossbow, he used the complex circuits for paralysis and silence. The logic was simple in theory. On one hand, there was Tekker who could shower the enemy with debuffs in a melee battle, and on the other, there was Link, who could aim at casters and other ranged opponents. And then there was their wizard that could also use all kinds of magic for damage and more. The only role Seth still wanted to fill was a strong melee damage dealer. Seth was able to deal a good amount of damage thanks to his items but lacked melee skills that made the best use of these items. Take a skill like Heavy Blow that could multiply the output and deal several times the weapon damage. It was a normal skill for a common warrior to have. Also, Seth did not want to be the main fighter. He wanted a party so he could leave this stuff to them. But with this Seth was sure that they would be able to manage anything not too overwhelmingly powerful, despite Earth being a lot scarier than Seth had thought. Even if the enemy was strong, if it could not move because of constant stuns, what could it do? Seth felt very satisfied when he looked at the finished crossbow. Nightmare Crossbow. Epic. Damage, 510. Durability, 2600. 135% chance to cause mental disruption on hit, effects, stun/confusion. 215% chance for a random curse to be added to an attack. 360% chance to silence a target on hit. 412% chance to paralyze a target on hit. 55% chance to poison a target on hit. 65% chance to burn target on hit. A new take on a crossbow by Journeyman Smith. Thanks to structure and design, the reload speed is increased by 30% and there is a rapid fire mode. The item sports superior performance thanks to special treatment. A nightmare for anyone that is on the wrong side of this weapon. Seth nodded. The crossbow looked pretty decent. The bone elements and string even gave a low poison and burn chance. On top of the crossbow, he decided to make a kitchen knife for the gourmet hunter. No, not a kitchen knife. A mithril knife for dismantling. It was nothing fancy. I was enchanted with superior sharpness, the complex circuit for sharpness which also helped with the edge retention and plus 35 strength so the hunter could dismantle even the toughest corpses. With this, Seth had more or less finished all the items he had wanted to make. He sat down to read the file about Urugiri. The city had been devastated by the first invasion of the Mer people. At this point, it was a ghost city. Mostly monster-infested ruins were left. The beasts' levels were in the mid-30s on average, so slightly higher than their party's average. But still high enough that Y City lacked people for a sweep to clean up the area. The most numerous were the beasts like the one that was used at the auction. Big amphibious berserker fish. But other maritime life was crawling inside the ruins that were given up by their previous inhabitants. It was really not a place for a 17 or 18-year-old girl to stay. After reading the file, Seth felt bored and decided to make some more arrow and crossbow bolt heads. He still had 85 snake teeth and decided to use 45 of them to make roughly 250 heads for arrows and bolts. With this, there would be another small chance to poison the target, as long as some magic was channeled into the projectile before firing. He packed away the tips and finished for the day. It was already late, but he left his room and went to the reception. He asked them to send a messenger to the members of his party so they could meet up tomorrow. He would give them their equipment and brief them on their first mission. He also instructed them to buy ready-made arrow shafts and bolts. Seth did not want to bother with making those himself. He did not have a skill for that, so it was not his job. Why waste time on something, if it does not even help grind his skills? With thoughts of the next day, he returned to his room and got ready for the night. Chapter 178. Gear Up. The next morning came as a surprise. Seth was woken up by knocks on his door. Drowsy, he got off his bed and went to the door. What were these guys doing here so early? At his door stood not a clerk, or maybe his 2 employees that lived on the same floor, no. There stood his 3 party members with unkempt hair and ruffled clothes. Allison was even still in her pajamas, just like Seth, and they stared at him with a huge grin. What are you guys doing here? He asked lazily, scratching his head. The others were undeterred. What do you mean? You asked us to come, right? You send us messengers so early in the morning. It has to be important, right? Link said excitedly. Seth's gears started running smoother as woke up more and more. Had these guys come running the moment they heard he would give them gear? The guys had at least worn streetwear. Allison's hair looked like a bird's nest and she was wearing wide pajamas with cute bears on them. Did she run here barefooted? Despite looking hungover, her eyes were the brightest of them all. Tekker, you have something hanging there, is that a sock? On the shoulder of his crumpled black t-shirt stuck a pink children's sock. Ah, oh. It's my daughter's. He said with a warm smile before putting the sock in his pocket. Stop evading the topic. Let's start the meeting right away. Link interrupted them. This guy was totally hyped. Seth had to throw a cold bucket of water over the gourmet hunter's expectations. No. You guys look like you rushed here right after waking up. You have to take better care of yourself. I will go wash up. You guys can take turns using the bath in the empty flat over there. And then we will go for breakfast. And then we can have the meeting. With that, he got rid of these 3 intruders and did what he said. Although the breakfast was not as enjoyable as usual with these 3 rascals urging him to hurry, he still made sure to get his fill. After a proper breakfast, they gathered in the cozy meeting room. Seth put down the file about Arajiri city so they could read it themselves. All of them made a complicated expression. Unlike Seth, who had only recently come to Y City, these 3 had been part of the war with the Oceanic Empire. All of them had fought hard in that war and had almost lost their lives more than once. They were still low-level back then and the invasion was repelled, but even now it was still a dangerous zone for them. On top of it came a slight trauma about the aquatic enemies. But none of them complained or argued not to go. To say it in a nice way, they were touched by the brother's tenacity to try and return to his sister. To say it in a realistic way, Seth was the leader and the guy that offered them a huge number of benefits. And the thought of coming back after a power-up and taking revenge on the monsters that had scarred them in their beginner days was also no small motivation. Okay, shall we come to the distribution of gear? The eyes around the table lit up like bonfires. Let's start with Tekker since he already has his armor set. Seth brought out a big box from his inventory and set it down before Tekker. Inside were the 2 fang shields and Seth explained their function as Tekker took them out. It's cursed. Tekker called out when Seth explained the cursed fang shield. Don't worry. Al assured me, that together with your heightened resistances and the bonuses from the shields, there is no danger. There is a reason why only one of them has that option. If you feel that something is wrong, you can change to the Raven's Beak. Besides the 2 shields was also a blood drinker Raven's Beak, like the one Seth had used to kill the Zarkists. Below the offensive gar was a smaller box with a necklace and 4 rings, the maximum number of rings one could usually wear. They were nothing fancy, as we originally meant to be sold in his shop. The only change Seth had done was to infuse souls to make their effects a permanent buff, instead of a temporary buff the user had to activate. 2 of the ring increased endurance/strength and the other 2 increased agility/willpower by 15 points each. The necklace increased HP regeneration and mana regeneration. He prepared similar sets for the other 2 and had spent about 80 small souls to upgrade these accessories. Allison's and Link's eyes twinkled when they heard they would get something comparable. The wizard's box was a little smaller since Seth had fewer things for her. He was simply not as versed in caster equipment and lacked the materials to make a good staff for her. This didn't mean that her gear was any less impressive. The woman in her pajamas squealed in joy when she appraised the long golden padded jacket. It was the first epic item of the day and it was hers. The others looked at her with envy, when Seth explained to them the effects of the golden jacket. Allison's rings primarily increased her agility and intelligence, as she had asked for. The necklace was focused on increasing mana regeneration. Seth had also found the time to make her a pair of leather shoes from the leftovers. They were rated rare and increased movement speed, wind, and earth affinity. The gourmet hunter was close to exploding from excitement when it was finally his turn. The first items from his box were the different parts of leather armor that would increase his survivability. Next were his accessories. The rings increased strength, agility, and dexterity, while the necklace had the shield skill. It was meant as a lifeline for the squishiest of their party. Link's eyes had slightly dimmed. He could not complain as all of them were awesome items and several times better than his current gears, but, compared to what the others got, he felt left behind. They lit up in excitement once again when he saw Seth pull out a dagger in its sheath. Finally! Would he also get some epic, super special item? A dismantling knife made of mithril. With this, you should be able to even dismantle dragons. It can also dabble as a kitchen knife on a field trip. Seth could not help but grin in schadenfreude as he saw the other's face fall. He had dashed the hunter's hopes once again. Of course, he could only act like this, since he knew what the last item would be. And lastly, the nightmare crossbow. Seth pulled out the almost black crossbow, with silvery engravings, white bone handles, and the golden glimmering crossbow string made of celestial bronze. Seeing the item in the blacksmith's hands, the gourmet hunter was petrified, since he could not express his emotions anymore at this point. He started explaining about the magazine and the effects of the crossbow, but there was no reaction from Link. His eyes were simply glued on the crossbow. And when Seth finally handed it to him, he hugged it like a lost child and started cheering. The rest of them could not help but laugh with him. His mood swings were simply too adorable. When he finally calmed down, Seth spoke up again. "All right, how about all of you equip your equipment now? I want to see how they will look on you." The party looked quite impressive after completely gearing up. There was the giant Dark Knight wielding two intimidatingly pointy shields. A female wizard in flowing golden cloth armor and a big new witch hat. A hunter clad in a full leather outfit and a fancy-looking crossbow. And lastly Seth in his dark red/black wyvern armor, silver/black gauntlets, and a big blade on his waist. "Let's visit a dungeon today, to get used to the power-up. I think we can set off for a Rajiri the day after tomorrow." Chapter 179. Power Up. This time around Seth led the party to a dungeon with an average level of 30. He was sure that they would have no problems with the new equipment. Here they would also be able to finally gain some experience. The range of choice in dungeons had increased since the last time they had visited the guild, and there were now more dungeons in the lower levels. It seemed that people started to understand that keeping these dungeons open was a benefit, not a danger. This was a good sign for Seth, since it meant that the average level of people would soon start rising, and so would the quality of materials. With more people in the higher levels, the demand for better equipment would rise, too. Players needed good equipment to gain levels faster. This only became more important the higher the level became. The dungeon was an apartment building filled with lizardmen. The setting felt terribly weird. Weren't lizardmen supposed to be in swamps? Normally one would expect zombies and other humanoid enemies in apartments, right? It was not just Seth, the rest of the party was also confused by it. The dungeon was technically a normal apartment building, but when they entered, they saw stuff like slime, moss, nests, and egg sacs sticking to the otherwise unchanged walls. Seth guessed that not every dungeon could be cool and thematically fitting. He burned the egg sacs from afar. He did not know whether this was the right move or not, but his gamer instincts told him that those could only contain disgusting stuff. And he really didn't want to be jumped by disgusting stuff. The lizardmen themselves were originally tough opponents. Their scales worked as natural armor, and they had overwhelming strength and agility. Normally only the elite teams of guilds and the Hunter Association would enter these dungeons to train and cull the herd. Talk 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 talk. 4 lizardmen at the end of the hallway keeled over, either stunned, paralyzed, or unconscious. On top of those, one was cursed with weakness and another got slightly burned. It was a reoccurring scene ever since they entered. The gourmet hunter had a naturally high luck stat, which meant almost every encounter ended like this. Seth had put away the wyvern blade and equipped the mind decay. He shared the job of finishing them from a distance with Allison, while Tecker and Puffles guarded the party. Had Seth overdone it a little? He didn't even get to use things like Dragon Might, because even if a mob came into melee range it was skewered by Tecker before he could even change weapons. Of course, it would seem weird if Seth complained about the easy experience, but was this really okay? It was fun at the start, but now it just felt like they were bullying the weak. It also meant they were theoretically able to easily deal with monsters in their level, range and physique. This made the traps in the dungeon the greatest danger left. One would not expect traps like poison darts, pitfalls, or pistons in an apartment building, but they were there. A step on the wrong tile, in a hallway covered with white tiles, could trigger a giant boulder to suddenly come rolling at them. It was thanks to Allison and Link that they were not squashed or skewered. Allison was able to use Dungeon Skin, which could reveal anomalies like trap triggers and treasure chests, but it only had a 45% accuracy. The gourmet hunter's skill in trap detection and especially defusal were invaluable. Mentioning treasure chests, they found some containing various potions and junk. They could sell those, but the most useful thing to Seth was still the small souls that kept dropping here and there. It was a shame that the rooms only looked like living spaces, but there was nothing they could scavenge like food or household supplies. Also, the experience. Lizardman brought Seth 0.5 to 2% experience. With enough mobs, he could have easily leveled up at this pace. It was a shame that there were no more than 60 lizardmen guarding the dungeon. The main obstacle was really the traps, while the monsters were distributed across the 20 floors of the building. The biggest gain for the party besides EXP was probably the lizardmen corpses. There was nothing that interested Seth, as the rating of their leather was too low. Still, Link diligently dismantled the corpses and put away the materials. Apparently, the meat had the potential for cooking, and some of their organs were used in alchemy for potions like water breathing, poison, and antidotes. Since they planned to have Allison pick up alchemy, everything of use was stored. What they did not need would be sold after they left the dungeon. After working their way up 19 floors and checking an uncountable number of rooms and apartments, they finally stood before the boss floor. Here they found a fountain of healing. Although they did not need it, the gesture was appreciated. Drinking a few gulps of the water alleviated their fatigue and brought them back to top form. Let's take a break. How about I cook something up? Link suddenly suggested. Seth never said no to a meal, and the others also readily agreed. Eating some buff food made by a cook could only ease their fight with the boss. Everyone had realized that they were pretty overpowered for this dungeon, but one could never have too big an advantage, right? The gourmet hunter brought out a big cauldron, all kinds of condiments, vegetables, and the lizardman meat he diligently cut with his new mithril knife. He filled the cauldron with water from the healing fountain. What are you cooking? Seth asked interestedly as he watched the hunter prepare the ingredients. I'm going to make a stew. It might take a while, but the chances are high that I might be able to make a food with a permanent buff. The water from the healing fountain and the lizardman meat are both rated uncommon. However, my skills are barely good enough to process these ingredients. Don't expect too much. All of them waited patiently for Link to finish cooking. The importance of buff food could not be underestimated. Chefs were one of the most appreciated jobs in the current era, as the buffs the player could get with food stacked with the buff from supports and were one of the few possibilities to compensate for the lack of good equipment. Without the improvements the meals brought before the battle, they might have completely lost the war against the Oceanic Empire. Seth was even clearer about the merits of food. It not only tasted good, but permanent improvements by food had no limit. Despite not getting a chance to eat such food during his time in Nemea, Seth had heard about the different options to permanently increase one's strength. In general, there were two reliable ways: potions and food. The potion had a huge effect, but one would only be able to use the same potion once or twice. The ingredients were expensive and the skill requirements to make them high. Food also had high skill requirements if a chef wanted to make one with a temporary or permanent buff. The advantage was that the one would not gain immunity. Theoretically, one could eat the same food over and over and gain stats from it. Of course, it had limitations. The effects always depended on the ingredients and the ones consuming them. A level 70 warrior with several hundred points in strength would not gain strength from a meal made out of a monster that was tremendously weaker than himself. One needed to consume those of similar or greater strength to gain something. As they started to get bored, Link finally jumped up and cheered. He had succeeded. Bowl of healthy lizard soup food, uncommon. Lizard soup like Mama used to make. Plus 1% resistance to diseases. Plus 30 strength, plus 20 agility, plus 5 HP regen/minute for 30 minutes. Resistance against diseases. Allison asked confused. Link also looked a little stumped. You two didn't know this exists? Seth asked them surprised. He ignored the fact that he also would not know without the bracelet that had a similar effect. Tekker had 25% disease resistance thanks to his class. In general, he had at least 25% resistance against everything. But reading the description again, Seth saw that the effect of the soup was different. It had no restraints like the bracelet, that differentiated between diseases of different ratings. This was 1% complete immunity to any and all diseases. He explained this to the other and unwittingly kicked off an eating competition. Even so, he did not know that the other had started hurrying to eat as much of the soup as possible. He was still the one to consume the most. With a big burp, he finished his 7th bowl and looked into his status window. He really had gained 7% resistance to all diseases. Puffles was in second place with 4% resistance. The others had only managed to get 2 or 3 bowls, but nobody was disappointed since there was still a lot of lizardman meat. They could make Link just cook more after they left the dungeon. But Link dashed their hopes. The water of the healing fountain loses its quality over time. It only works fresh. So, unless we find something of similar quality, I will probably fail to give it a permanent effect. At least until my skill grows stronger. Slightly dejected, they got ready to vent their distress on the boss. Chapter 180. Tear Up. Floor 20, the highest floor below the roof, was one wide hall. The dungeon core was sparkling on the wall opposite of the stairs they had just ascended. Between them and the core was a hulking lizardman. He was about twice the size of the regular ones, so about 4 m in height. This one actually wore a kind of barbarian leather armor and a huge single-bladed sword with a jagged edge. It greeted them with a roar that shook the whole floor. It was not done roaring when a wave of bolts was sent on their way to shut it up. To their surprise, it did not work. Just before they hit the giant lizard, they were deflected by an invisible shield. Behind the hulking boss hid a decrepit and old lizardman in a tattered brown robe. It had cast a shield for its warrior. This was probably the dungeon master. Boss, Lizardman Chieftain Leave 33. Elite, Lizardman Shaman Leave 35. Seth had heard about it, but never experienced that the dungeon master fought together with the boss. As the bolts had been defused by the support mage in the back, it was time for regular party play. Tekker, can you occupy the big guy? Sure, the big man said enthusiastically. Tekker put on his helmet, stepped forward. With the set complete, the Dark Knight armor's set effect activated. Since they were facing an elite and a boss, they were not intimidated, but still weakened. The chieftain understood the tank's actions as a challenge and focused on the knight with 2 shields. Allison, you take care of the magic. I and Link focus on the shaman. Allison started casting while Seth and Link focused their ranged attacks on the shaman. Since it had to evade and block their attacks, it was unable to help the tank in its fight against Tekker. Seth could have used Dragon Might, but he had a good reason not to. If he solved every little fight with this skill and overwhelmed the opponent, the party would become weak. Without the experience to work together, they would be doomed if they one day met an opponent immune to Dragon Might. Since this fight was not dangerous, it was a good chance to train. In his new gear, Tekker was able to rival the giant lizard in overall strength. Unfortunately, he really lacked in damage. Because of the chieftain's own high defense and boss status, most of the debuffs had a lowered activation chance and were hard to trigger. Tekker's luck was not enough to overcome this disadvantage. The shaman kept blocking the aiming arrows of Seth and evaded Link's volleys, making the fight a stalemate. It did not last for long. Dispel, their wizard shouted. Allison was done casting and a soft wave of wind washed over the room. As the name suggested, it was magic that dispelled all magic in the room and hindered the use of magic for 10 seconds. The moment the shaman lost his shield, he was hit in the lungs by the mind decay and in the head by the nightmare crossbow. The shaman had not even time for a last breath as it keeled over, leaving the chieftain behind to deal with a group of bloodlusty intruders. It did not take long for them to tear up the lizardman. With the gourmet hunter and Tekker working together, the debuffs started to stack on the boss. Seth equipped the wyvern blade and started sneaking up behind the almost stun-locked chieftain. With one swing he cut the giant beast across the lower back. Lacerate, he recovered the blade in a smooth movement and activated the skill for a strike straight down. It cut off the chieftain's tail in a massive spurt of blood and Seth gained +1 in strength. Allison stole the last hit with a wind blade that beheaded the chieftain. The headless body slowly knelt down, before crashing to the floor with a loud thump. The whole fight lasted less than 2 minutes. The core almost wanted to cry. It had just summoned these promising champions after the dungeon was wiped a week ago. Link got into carving up the 2 corpses. The shaman was a hopeless case, but the chieftain was a great source of materials. His leather was uncommon, so Seth was actually willing to keep it. Ho ho! This guy actually had one. Link suddenly cheered out and held up a bloody irregular formed crystal. A beast core? So what? Seth asked, confused. What was there to cheer about? These cores were a very common resource in Aura and could be used as the power source for an item's enchantment or a power nucleus for equipment. Depending on their quality, they could also bring additional effects. But that was the crux of the matter. It all depended on the quality. Most cores were a cheap and unstable option compared to even common gemstones. And those that were useful were overpriced because of their rarity. Seth simply had better options and thus never used them during his time in Aura. From Seth's perspective, his reaction was normal, but the rest of the party looked at him with shock. So what? It's a beast core. And a big one. We can get a lot of money for this, the hunter called out. After some explaining, Seth understood what was going on. In Aura, these cores were usually used as a power source for some specific magic tool, but that was it. There were many other better methods to get around using beast cores. It was different in Earth, a world with high technological advancement. People were used to and dependent on all kinds of devices. As Earth still lacked knowledge about magic formations that could gather energy from the surrounding even without a nucleus, these cores that could be used like batteries were the first step to rebuilding technology. The government and researchers with corresponding classes had a high interest to buy them for their research. The lack in numbers and strength of adventurers that could easily farm these resources increased the price once again. This uncommon rated core with the size of a fist was just as precious as an uncommon item, which ranged in the millions. Mentioning items, the two also dropped some items. The shaman dropped an uncommon crystal sphere that decreased casting time by 10% and increased the power of magic by 15%. This was better than what Allison currently owned, so it went to her. It also dropped arm wraps that increased mana regeneration by 10 per minute. She was able to wear these below the golden jacket. The chieftain left behind his armor and the giant's sword. Neither was of use to them, but could be sold since at least the armor was uncommon. After cleaning the corpses came mugging the core. A treasure chest was already waiting in front of the core. It contained some gold, silver, potions, a dagger, and a circlet. Seth tried blackmailing the core, but it did not work this time. It did not spit out any more. Although Seth was convinced, the reason might be that parties regularly managed to get to this point, so the core was broke. The two items were actually a common set made of iron. The set effect was to lower the wearer's presence by 5%. Seth could only shake his head. This was almost too bad to even sell. The dungeon core might really be broke. With that, they left the dungeon. Despite the core being a blank, the materials they had harvested and the items for their mage made the dive worth it. Alright, I think you are used to the new items. We should be able to set off tomorrow. Is everyone okay with that? Seth talked to them on the way back. Arim, could we maybe wait another day? Tekker asked embarrassed. Seth looked at him questioning. He had judged their tank as a very reliable man. He probably had a reason. The journey will take about a week, right? My babysitter ditched me after we went missing for a week and I need to find someone who can take care of my daughter until we return.